Chapter 2250. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 2250. While if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2250. While Lionel didn't say anything, and his expression didn't change. He simply stood there and waited. Blood sovereigns are different from the rest of us. Sovereigns in general. Being a sovereign is like catching a glimpse of the life state before stepping foot into it truly. The life state was the second last state of force manipulation there was. It represented, apparently, the so-called second dimension, a dimension in which only the regulator could exist in. It was apparently where the spark of life, and the way little Nana's elder brother had described it, it made Lionel think of the Big Bang theory of Earth. An instant of time that was both instant and yet infinite. It was a beautiful picture that he wasn't in the headspace to admire. It's that faint hint of the life state that allows your force to have seemingly inexplicable properties. It's why your spear force can recognize what is and isn't a spear, and it's also why it can swallow up lesser spear forces. Though, if your enemy was of the life state, this ability would be rendered useless unless you were likewise in the life state. Elryan shook his head, feeling that he was explaining too much. For some reason, beneath Lionel's gaze, he felt that he was in the presence of his father, and he wanted to over-explain himself rather than under-explain. But even this thought felt ridiculous. His father was an existence the like of which could force existence itself to tremble. He couldn't fathom comparing him to Lionel. And yet here he was. Each sovereign is special in their own way, and you can either be born with the ability, or you can comprehend it yourself, though the latter is far more difficult. The blood sovereign is special in that its sovereign state is a physical manifestation of its body, same for similarly titled sovereigns that don't fall into the usual weapon force categories. The reason ninth-dimensional existences are so hard to kill is because the life state is birthed into their bodies once they enter that realm. The separation between powerful, ninth-dimensional existence and weak ones is whether or not they've comprehended this kernel of life state or not. For many ninth-dimensional existences, especially the ones you'll come across, this kernel is the only sense of the life state that they'll gain in their entire lives. Even for those that do comprehend this kernel, many of their forces will still be stuck at the impetus state, however this won't stop their strength from being elevated to an extreme level. You might have guessed it by now with this explanation, but blood sovereigns gather their power from their own blood. They're adept at manipulating it and using it to swallow the blood of others. In order to do that and not lose themselves, a part of their soul is always dispersed within their blood, but that's not important. Even if it wasn't, she could still be saved. That's because her very blood is laced with the life state already. She is essentially like a ninth-dimensional expert in that she can't be killed so easily without the help of someone of a regulator or someone that can somewhat ignore a regulator. She's only really missing one thing. Elryan looked off toward where Aina's body had been as though remembering the sight of something. But it seems like you already have that one thing. She's like a ninth-dimensional expert, but she isn't truly one. Her force hasn't reached a high enough state to exist for long periods of time. If too much time passed, she would truly die. However, you have vital star force, the life force of the body. So long as enough of her blood remains, and you're able to get to her in time, you can use your vital star force to stimulate her revival. You also seem to have the perfect vessel for her too. The only problem is, your vital star force has to at least be in the impetus state, and you're only half a step in. That's not enough. At best your vital star force can sustain her, but it can't revive her, and you'll need to give her quite a large amount every day. You're lucky that you happen to have the perfect force, and it's at just the right level too. If it was only at the fourth layered state, it wouldn't be enough even to sustain her. Unfortunately, I do not have expertise in vital star force, nor do any of the companions I've brought. Or else I would try to help you. Lionel looked at Elryan for a long while and then nodded slowly. The smoldering smoke coming from the edges of his eyes and the soles of his bare feet edged away slightly and became almost imperceptible to the eye. Though, they didn't fade entirely. Anastasia, Lionel said lightly. You know, I don't like your tone, young man. I can even count how many times older than you I am. She probably wouldn't have said this had Aina been definitely dead, but knowing there was a good chance to reverse all of this, she was in a good mood. N-O/V//E-L-B-1-. N, how far away can you sense force? Lionel asked. In this broken world? Anywhere, she replied. Can you find out for me if there's a spiritual with a vital star force innate node? Or any race, for that matter. She blinked, but she immediately understood. Although Lionel was just a half step from the impetus state, it wasn't so easy to cross. Having taken a half step, he could feel that impossibly vast chasm, and he knew it might very well take even him years to cross that line. He refused to leave Aina in that state for years if he didn't have to. Innate nodes were cheat codes in increasing your force manipulation. So long as he fueled one for long enough, it would definitely be able to help him to cross that half step. But he needed the node first. Elryan's gaze flickered, but he didn't say anything. I can check, but you should know that even among spirituals, not all of them have innate nodes, and those that do usually just awaken normal, middle-of-the-road, elemental innate nodes. The odds that one would have a vital star force innate node, especially given the fact that this isn't an aspect spirituals excel in, is very low. I will look, but just manage your expectations. It will also take me quite a while, probably a few days. Lionel nodded lightly. Chapter 2251. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10:41 AM. Chapter 2251. Smoldering. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2251. Smoldering. Lionel truly waited for those days. He didn't move, he didn't check on his mother, he simply meditated in the depths of space, without thought for water or food, or even entertainment. His entire mind was focused on comprehending the path of the vital star force, the very path that he had maybe neglected the most until this point. He didn't rely entirely on Anastasia. In fact, he smartly made the assumption that she would fail. If this was the case, then he would have to do whatever he could to speed up the process as much as he could. He could not, would not, leave Aina to be in that state for even a second longer than he had to. Elryan didn't move either. He might have been 14 years old, but time seemed irrelevant to him. He had the patience of a monk that had lived for an impossible number of years. He didn't say anything, and he even only seemed to breathe a few times a day. Slowly, though, his injuries were becoming far better. By the end of the 4th day, he had actually recovered a great deal. If others saw how long it was taking to be fully recovered, especially those that understood the true majesty of the Pluto race, they would be stunned speechless. This was a man who had healed his arm and leg being severed in an instant of time as though nothing at all had happened. It could only be said that those that had harmed him were truly monsters. I'm sorry, Lionel, there's no such innate node here. Lionel's eyes opened and he nodded lightly. He had already expected this. He rose to his feet, or rather let his feet fall from their meditating position, and stepped forward, crossing the distance to Elryan in an instant. He raised his foot again, to take another step, but Elryan's large hand had landed on his shoulder. Or, rather, half of his palm had. He was so much larger than Lionel that the other half of his hand hung off. I know you won't listen to me, but I feel like I should say this anyway. Absorbing the innate nodes of others will never be perfect. There will always be some hidden flaw, even if you use the best methods available to you, or even me for that matter. When it comes time for you to become to enter the 9th dimension, it will only hold you back. If you want new nodes, the best course of action is to form them on your own. Lionel's turned a smoldering gaze toward Elryan. Streams of black smoke, hot to the touch, were still coming out of the corners of his eyes and the soles of his feet. Though they were much weaker than they had been before, Elryan still felt that searing pain when he met Lionel's gaze, and it was even more exaggerated now than it had been in the past. And Elryan hesitated again. Killing is already a heavy enough burden on one's path forward. If you snatch things of importance from those that you kill on top of that, it will make things even more difficult. If even on top of that, what you snatch is of enough importance that you rely on it heavily to progress, the burden will be even heavier. And that's not just for you. If you use this method to help your loved one, she will suffer as well. No VE/LB, 1 and Lionel didn't say anything. Ryan was talking about a concept so abstract that it was for anyone to wrap their heads around it, but he had already known it existed the moment that Anastasia had told him it was impossible to revive Ana's mother because Ana was too powerful. Those lines of time, of fate, of karma, whatever you wanted to call them, could bind anyone. And the more powerful you became, the heavier the burden became. There's no burden I can't carry, Lionel said before vanishing. Ryan's lip twitched. He didn't even ask about how to forge his own innate nodes. But in the end, Ryan sighed. What would be the point if he had? One could only do such a thing when given an extremely special opportunity, and even that wasn't necessarily without risks. Lionel was learning firsthand just how dangerous it was to have powerful innate nodes. If he took one from others, as he already had, or if he forged new ones, it would be even more dangerous. This was such an important rule that even Ryan himself only had a single innate node. His father refused to allow him to forge more, although he definitely could. He could even replace all 10 of his nodes with innate nodes if he so wanted to. Author's note, not a typo, Lionel returned to the location of his mother. She sat in a meeting with the remainder of the Luxniks, or maybe what the Luxniks would become. They seemed to be in the middle of a war against an existence they couldn't even quite name. But Lionel appeared out of nowhere, causing the Luxniks to suddenly stand violently, ready to fight. Stop. This is the man who defeated the creature, you should be thanking him. Alienor said with a powerful voice. The Luxniks were astonished and then froze in place. Lionel looked around, still not quite understanding what was going on. It's time to return home, Mom. Alienor's gaze flickered, and the expressions of the Luxniks changed. When had their matriarch had a child? And when had he grown so large? And so powerful at that? In the end, Alienor nodded slowly. She had only continued this farce because she thought it would still be important to the zone. But since it wasn't, that would be fine. Come with me, Alienor said to Lionel. Though they would be leaving, there were still certain things she wanted to show Lionel first. Halt. A man stood with a furious gaze, he was practically spewing hot fire. This was his wife they were talking about, how dare, bang. Lionel's fist was like a tide of smoldering heat. Chapter 2252. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10 and 25 seconds AM. Chapter 2252, Violet wins if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 2252 Violet wins. Lionel could guess what the problem was. He just didn't have the time to care about it, or coddle this man's feelings. Just because there was no vital star force innate node in this time, didn't mean there wasn't one in his time. And he wanted to find out before he decided what his next step would be. Every second someone delayed him, was another second that Ana would spend dead. This person was lucky that they were a member of the Luxniks family, or else he would have just directly killed him. Though he knew that time didn't work linearly, he still didn't want to risk what might happen if the wrong person died. But his message was clear and obvious. Alienor looked at this scene with a complicated expression, but didn't say anything. She knew that her son wasn't in the best of moods, and though she didn't know what he had gone to do in the last few days, she knew that it was definitely related to Ana. Be kinder to them, they don't understand, Alienor said after some hesitation. I think they understand more than they've told you outright, Lionel responded. Or more accurately, they haven't repeated it before you in these last few days. But the Luxniks family here isn't the same as the ones we know from our timeline. The man coughed up a mouthful of blood, his situation quite haggard. If not for the fact he suddenly felt a rising heat charging through his nodal pathways, he would have already tried to get up and charge forward. However, he realized that if he was any more reckless, he would burn to ash from the inside out. Alienor's gaze flickered, but she didn't say anything. After a moment, she turned and began to lead Lionel away. She knew that his words were correct too, but it was difficult to just outright ask questions that she already knew the answer to. It would cause suspicion and make her task more difficult. But that didn't mean that she hadn't done her own research. And that was precisely what she was leading Lionel into. I'm not sure what was going on here, but there was a powerful beast located in this region that was overseeing a great deal of things. For whatever reason, though, it never took action personally to wipe the rest of us out, as though it was wary of something. But this. Alienor stepped out from the underground passageway and into a room of lightly glowing violet. Lionel's gaze sharpened. As far as the eye could see, there were countless tubes filled with a thick, pale violet liquid. It was far more like a gel than anything else, and it was sturdy enough that it held the humans inside them in place. This violet liquid, he recognized it. He had definitely felt it from Richard. No VE/LB, 1N, in the last several years, these 3 planets have been like a farm. That's the best word that I can use to describe it. 90% of it were factories just like this one, while the remaining 10% were lands more like the ones we're just in, and the latter was ruled by our Luxnix family. In reality, we were more like farmers, having children, raising them, only to have the majority of them chosen for this sick science experiment. I've felt the weight of this force before, from that Richard boy. I know I told you that you might be interested in it, but now I'm quite happy that you didn't pay attention to my silly words. I don't know what this force is, but it is incredibly dangerous. It's quite clear to me that they don't even trust themselves with this power, which is why they've instead chosen to experiment on us, though I don't know why. Lionel knew exactly why. The human race was the very same race that succeeded in accepting the powers of the god beasts. Who knew what other kind of potential they might have lying dormant? This violet force, it felt powerful, extremely so. But it was also something that he felt no one person could possibly control because the words came to him like a tide. Because they broke the fundamental laws of reality. In these few days, he had only split his attention away from improving his vital star force for a single reason, and that was to talk to one of his prisoners. Richard. In that time, he found out exactly what the ability of violet force was. It broke the laws of causality, the most fundamental rules of equivalent exchange. Whatever you gave, you always received more in return. If you punched with 100 pounds of force, you would explode with one with 200 pounds of power. If you ran at 10 kilometers an hour, you would find yourself at the end of that hour having run 15 kilometers instead. You could exchange years for more years, time for more time. It was fundamentally impossible in nature, no matter how strong you were, and definitely regardless of how weak you were. The violet winds rise north. Lionel felt his body quake and he suddenly violently bent over, his body shaking. He coughed, feeling something within him stir. "Fuck off," he said coldly. The stirring figure in the pool of crimson came to a stop, its connection to Lionel being violently ripped apart. Lionel stood to his full height as though nothing had happened. "Mom, I'll take these factories with us." Alienor, who had just gone from worrying about Lionel to confused, couldn't say very much as Anastasia appeared and began to swallow up the factories as though nothing at all had happened. These were all failures, Lionel knew that. In fact, the fact Richard continued to live in the dimensional verse at all meant that the entire project was a meaningless failure, so much so that they had abandoned them altogether. However, Lionel still took them. As for what he wanted to do with them, maybe only he knew. Chapter 2253. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10 and 23 seconds AM. Chapter 2253. Deserved. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2253. Deserved. There's something else I want to show you, Alienor said after Lionel had finished. Alienor led Lionel through the somewhat familiar catacombs again, but this time, there was a barrier up ahead, one formed by the Luxnix family. It seemed that they had almost guessed that this was where Alienor would go. Or rather, they had assumed that this would be the first location she brought Lionel, and had even begun doubting their own judgment until they finally appeared. Lionel moved, but Alienor held his shoulder, stopping him. She didn't use a lot of force, but Lionel wouldn't just casually brush off his own mother's arm, at least she thought so. And luckily, he didn't seem to be rage-fueled enough to do so. She lied lightly. Lionel was too smart to casually let something so detrimental to them slip. He probably only called her mom so that he would have someone to fight. It was uncharacteristic, but what it told Eleanor was that her son was still very much a child. Lionel might be 26, but it was hard to grow and mature when everything came so easy to you, and even more difficult when you had to fake much of your outward appearance. Eleanor knew exactly what that felt like. This wasn't just because she was a princess with a father like Emperor Fox, but it was also because she was extremely talented from a young age. It took her a long while, and meeting Velasco, to finally mature into the woman she was today. But even then, she had had her mother. Velasco's method of raising Lionel had grown into a self-confident and perfect warrior. He could face the battlefield without a change to his expression, and even smile at that. He was a true Morales. Eleanor didn't hate what her husband had chosen to do. Velasco had likely known the kind of situation they were in and that very soon, they would have to face a world far larger than their own. However, it had still neglected Lionel as a person. Not entirely, of course. Because Velasco knew the type of person Lionel was, he was able to mold Lionel's character with just 2 words, respect and persistence. Another child wouldn't understand such an abstract thing, but Lionel had grown around those 2 words, slowly molding their definitions into his own understanding until he became a level-headed man who could see right from wrong. He still knew right from wrong. His mind was more than sharp enough to grasp it, he just didn't care right now. And that was what was missing. When logic couldn't lead Lionel to why he should care, then something else had to. Eleanor ignored everyone else and looked Lionel in the eyes, cupping both of his cheeks. The billowing black fog that came from the corner of his eyes singed her hands and burnt them slowly, but she didn't seem to notice, looking toward Lionel deeper and deeper as though she was trying to understand something. "Little lion, my father said something about you that I can't quite understand, but I still believe to be true. He said you and your father are the 2 greatest men he's ever met. Do you want to prove the both of us wrong?" Lionel didn't say anything, looking at his mother. He would feel much better if he could just steamroll them all, he knew he would. He hadn't vented nearly enough against the shadow tail, it just wasn't as satisfying when it wasn't his own raw power, it wasn't as pleasing. Your father was a man who held this sort of rage within himself, but do you know what happened when he lost control over his own mind? He harmed Anastasia, a companion that had been by his side for countless years. The Void Palace, the deeper, hidden branches of the Morales family, the 3-finger cult, these were all existences that your father could have destroyed whenever he wanted. It would have been easy, just a snap of his fingers. Do you know why he didn't? Why he let them insult him behind his back? To show fear in his face, and yet scheme against his interests in the dark? Do you believe that your father was stupid, little lion? Lionel's fists clenched, the billowing trail of smoke becoming thicker and thicker. Eleanor's hands were practically black now, but she still didn't release Lionel's cheeks, her eyes looking at him with a slightly watery look. It's because they weren't worth his time, it's because he had a bigger, larger goal, it's because he was able to place down his temporary satisfaction for the sake of something larger than himself. He couldn't gain satisfaction from others, he could only find it within himself. There'll no doubt be many who speculate about your father's death. Many ignorant people who don't understand what he truly faced and believe that he had simply overestimated himself. Did he ever spare a thought for those people? Did he even care to look at them? Lionel's fists were clenched so hard that they twitched despite his usual steady control, the space around them splintering beneath a roaring wave of destruction. Lionel took deep breaths, the winds and the surroundings growing agitated before he slowly calmed down. He had lost count of the number of people he had killed to vent his rage. He had once always kept track of the exact number, but it was lost to him now, dancing within a dense blob of memories beyond him and only accessible to his enlightened self. And it was possible that even he hadn't bothered to count. The number was easily in the trillions, an impossible number, vast and endless as the rivers of blood. And yet the rage was still there, it was still smoldering, it was still overflowing, boiling and rattling as though his body was a lid it was trying to pop off. He hadn't made those that had actually attacked his father pay, they were already dead at his hands. It had all been meaningless, a vast chasm of emptiness that only deepened with every death, many of whom had done nothing at all and were as innocent as could be. Did he feel bad? No, he really couldn't bring himself to. he didn't have the capacity anymore. Did he know it was wrong? That, at least he could admit. He closed his eyes and the smokiness ebbed into a slow stream once more. Did he want this wrath to disappear? No n-/o. V/E/L/B 1 but he would direct it to where it was deserved. Chapter 2254. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10 and 20 a.m. Chapter 2254. Key if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2254. Key. Eleanor smiled lightly, pinching Lionel's cheeks as though he was still a little boy. She hadn't gotten to do this and took pleasure in every second. Unfortunately, she didn't get to see Lionel's embarrassed expression. She was certain that a 26-year-old having his cheeks pinched by his mom like this might react with a blush, but Lionel only stared at her with certainty and stability. Inwardly, she couldn't help but laugh to herself. Confidence and self-assurance wasn't something that Lionel lacked. Half of her speech was probably useless. Her son didn't gain validation from others, but the problem was that he was walking down a path of cruelty that was almost impossible to turn back from, and she wasn't sure that she had helped him turn back. She could only hope that he would have more control over his emotions. At the very least, exposing their relationship so that he would have a reason to get into another fight was far beneath him, and he likely knew this as well. Eleanor released Lionel and the latter raised his hand. With a flash, his body changed, growing about half a foot. His eyes turned golden and his pupils became sharp, slit lines. His hair turned a furious and aggressive white gold color that shone like the sun, and his usually facial hair-free face gained just as aggressive sideburns. His canines lengthened and claws grew from his hands. His heart thumped like the growl of a wild beast and the bloodlines of the Luxniks before him seemed to cool into an icy flow, their bodies freezing in place. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't seem to muster up the courage to fight back. NOVLB, 1 and Eleanor nodded slightly. Lionel had indeed had a non-violent method of dealing with these people. What was the snowy star owl lineage factor to the golden tiger lineage factor? Especially when one of his arms was coated with the god beast of creation. The two walked by, and the members of the Luxnik seemed to resign themselves to the situation. What else could they do? It was clear that this son of their matriarch was far beyond their understanding. When they had entered the temple, one that was once again extremely familiar to Lionel, his expression couldn't help but become serious, if it was even possible for his current self to become any more serious. In the position of where Lionel had first found the bronze tablet, it was still there. The difference was that there was a silver tablet present as well, and on top of that, a golden tablet. Confusion painted Lionel's thoughts. Why would this be here? And if it was here now, then why wasn't it here in the future? Logic would tell him that it was because he had taken it here and now, so how could it be here in the future? But then why didn't everything else work like that? He had just destroyed the world of dimensional cleanse, so how was it there for him to benefit from in the future? It was clear and obvious that time didn't work linearly, so something else must have taken it. But then what did that mean for the timeless event? Lionel's pupils constricted. Elryan had said that there should be a timeless event that occurred here, so where was it? Unless the shadow tale. Lionel's thoughts spun. The time around a timeless event should be stricter in flow than other points in time. It was easier to snip, loop and rearrange normal points in time, but a timeless event was fixed. What happened here would definitely reverberate into the future. It seemed that Lionel was very much correct to not kill that man with a single fist. Had he, depending on what relation he had to himself, he could have very well ended up ending his own life. Lionel didn't have the cold shiver of a reaction one might expect from such a revelation. If anything, it had only emboldened him because it only meant that he was correct once again. Something had told him to be cautious, and listening to his inner voice and his calculation abilities had never failed him. Then what does it mean if I took those that should have become the members of the Viola family? What would change? The moment Lionel had this thought, he immediately sat down where he was. Without a word, he entered an intense state of meditation. Eleanor wasn't to say something, but she held back. She had tried meditating on the golden tablet as well. She thought that with her talent it would be a simple thing to see what was on the other side. She had already formed the starry-tailed fox lineage factor long before anyone else in the Luxnix had. As she had expected, things flowed smoothly from one step to the next, and she formed the twinkling light bear lineage factor, and then soon succeeded in forming the golden tiger lineage factor, although it had taken her much more effort. But when she got to the golden tablet, she couldn't even sense what the creature hidden deep within was, let alone comprehending it. She even felt, for the first time in her life, even if she dedicated years to it she would never succeed. What she didn't know, though, was that Lionel wasn't attempting to meditate on the golden tablet at all. With a single glance, he knew his current body didn't have what it took. It would be nothing more than a waste of time. If he had to guess what it would take, he would have to do one of three things. Either become a light and star sovereign, raise his scarlet star force innate node to at least the 8th dimension, probably nearer the pinnacle and close to the 9th, or comprehend both light and star force to the life state. He would reach that level one day, but that wasn't today. His goal was different. Chapter 2255. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10 and 19 seconds AM. Chapter 2255. Good luck, Master. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2255. Good luck, Master. These were just guesses on his part, and it could very well take more than that. But what mattered most to him now were what changes would occur in the future. Half a day later, he opened his eyes with a confident light. Indeed, the changes that would occur in the future should have already occurred, otherwise the silver and golden tablets wouldn't have been missing already. But that wasn't why he had meditated for half a day. He had already concluded that in the first couple of minutes. Instead, he was confirming something else. He was certain he could use timeless events to change the future. This might be the key to reviving his father. If he played his cards correctly, he could most definitely change those events, of that he was certain. Whatever the rest of the details were, he didn't care. But he would need to be able to do one thing. He would have to be able to predict a timeless event before it happened. And if he couldn't, then he would have to trigger one himself. He was sure that he could do it because Elryan had made it quite clear what it took for one to appear, and that was any event that caused the northern star to come closer. These were the thoughts of a madman. Everyone wanted to avoid such events to the best of their abilities because it would mean that existence itself was one step closer to being destroyed, but Lionel didn't seem to spare a thought to this at all. Hadn't he just stopped a timeless event? Then the world owed him already. And even if it didn't, so what? In his mind, he would already sacrifice the world for the sake of Aina. He had already done it before. If it was for the sake of his father, he would sacrifice existence itself. Lionel looked up to find that his mother was still standing there, patient and unhurried. When she saw that Lionel opened his eyes without any change, she smiled understandingly. It's very difficult to comprehend, don't be too hard on yourself. From what I can tell, you need something beyond just light and star affinity to succeed. You need an in-depth comprehension of the two that exist beyond this realm. I don't believe that even those outside worlds would find it easy. There were definitely many life and star experts out there, Lionel was sure. But they lacked the flexibility of the human body. It was this in conjunction with proper affinity and force manipulation that could allow them to touch upon that power. It was still beyond the current Alienor, but Lionel was confident that she would reach that level soon enough. As for him, he felt that it was guaranteed. Lionel didn't correct his mother about what he was meditating about, it was true anyway. He did, indeed, have no ability to claim the highest level of his lineage factor just yet. With a wave of his hand, the silver and golden tablets were taken with him. Is that everything? He asked. Yes, we can go now, Alienor confirmed. Lionel led his mom into the segmented cube. He looked around, trying to see if he could spot anything. In an unknown number of years, Wise Star Order would come here and then bind himself to the bronze tablet. He had already checked the tablet, but there was definitely no sign of Wise Star Order, and he had long since vanished from the segmented cube, even taking Vice and Candle with him. It was almost amusing how he hadn't used the two in order to save them as a trump card, but now he would never be able to. He didn't find himself caring much. Wise Star Order had at least never hurt anyone around him. Though, whether that was because Lionel was ignorant to when he had tried or not, that was a matter that only time would tell, along with what goals Wise Star Order truly had. When he truly couldn't find anything, Lionel turned and left, stepping into the segmented cube and streaking toward Earth. Not long after he had done so, the matriarch's husband stepped into the temple. Looking around and seeing that they had left, he surprisingly sighed a breath of relief, stretching out his back while leaning backward and pressing against his hips. Damn, I'm getting too old for this. You're young right now, though. Fuck you, damned brat. You have the time to contact me from the future now, but what about the last 3 years? Were you too busy on vacation? Too busy fucking everything with 2 legs and a pair of breasts? I resent that. I don't have long to live, you know. I thought you'd be nicer to me. Bah, you're not getting any sympathy from me and my old bones. How many times have I experienced death because of you? Now you fear it? Where's your humanity? Fear it? The voice laughed boisterously. I fear nothing. Easy to say that when you know some part of you will live on, but I'm glad you finally made this choice. I told you when I met you that it was a fruitless endeavor, and you just refused to listen. Instead, you've put me, not to mention that poor girl, through hardship again and again. She won't remember it. But I will. And there you go again, using logic over everything. What happened to humanity? Have I taught you nothing? The voice chuckled. You've taught me plenty, old man. Humanity isn't on the list, though. Have some respect, Dash. Need I list off some of your greatest hits? The list is quite long. Let's see, yes, here there's stealing that emperor's wife, and then there was the time you pissed over that city wall, oh right, there's also the time that woman pissed you off so much that you rap, enough. You describing those things so simply makes it seem like I wasn't in the right. You should have more respect for your master. In fact, you should actually call me that for once. Oh, would you look at that? Your 1327th death is on the way. Good luck. The matriarch's husband practically pulled at his hair. Talking to this brat was truly infuriating. NOVLB, and from the skies above, a shadow suddenly appeared from a gaping, spinning black hole. A second shadow tail had appeared. It seemed that changing timeless events wasn't so simple after all. Good luck, Master. Chapter 2256. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10 and 15 seconds AM. Chapter 2256. Godchild. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2256. Godchild. The matriarch's husband stepped out into the air, facing the monster in the skies. His hands were clasped behind his back without even the slightest intent on defending himself. Was there a point? His death was inevitable. No one could ever tell what the trigger of a timeless event was. It was also impossible to tell just how many people would be allowed to die, or how many you could save before the backlash of the timeless event made the event far worse. Many had tried to fight against timeless events before. The strongest of them sent armies of entire worlds at these timeless events, losing an uncountable number of experts all in a vain attempt. What was clear through all of these attempts was one thing, N/0 it was hopeless. The more you fought against a timeless event, the worse it became, the more bloody, the more violent. The best way to deal with a timeless event was to slow it down and minimize risk, hopefully finding out what the center point of it all was and allowing just that event alone to happen. While doing this wouldn't change the fact the Northern Star would most definitely come closer, it would still help those related to the event feel somewhat better. Rarely, though, did a timeless event necessitate the death of just a small number of people. Usually it required at least several hundred, each one changing the course of history in their own way and causing a tsunami tide of changes in the far-off future. Even rarer was it that a timeless event necessitated the death of just a single individual, but this was exactly such an event. And this single individual who had to die was none other than the matriarch's husband, or more accurately, Wise Star Order. He didn't go by any other name, or maybe he had just lived for so long that he had forgotten what his original name was. He might have asked these people what his name had been the first few times he was revived at the whims of that terrible disciple of his, but he couldn't be bothered to any longer. He no longer had the patience for it. Plus, he preferred Wise Star Order. He was indeed very wise, and very handsome at that, though that had nothing to do with his name. Wise Star Order suited him, it also suited his duty. He had long since become indifferent to these deaths. You could become numb to anything if you experienced it enough. But this time, he had a wide smile on his face. That disciple of his had finally gotten his act together. It was a beautiful day indeed. A beautiful day to die. To others, death was the end. But in reality, to Wise Star Order, his death on this day all those years ago, or actually, today, yes, indeed, it was today. How had he forgotten that? That brute was descending from the skies, he couldn't forget that. Regardless, death for him was just the beginning. To the people of this world, savants were extraordinary, they were talents that needed to be hoarded away and saved. But they were deeply flawed, and they obviously weren't so extraordinary if they could be so easily captured in the first place. To the wider world, the whole of existence out there, savants were defects, poor imitations of the real thing. Poor imitations of existences born to be gods. Wise Star Order raised his hands and laughed toward the skies as the shadow tail descended. Come here, you big brute. In the future, I'll slaughter you kind like children, I'll bathe the seas in your blood and I'll die bang. Wise Star Order was hit out of the skies, crashing through the entire planet. His body only seemed to hold its shape for a small moment on the other side before it burst into a rain of blood, leaving behind nothing but a small, transparent ball. His ethereal glabella. Son of a bitch, that bastard never lets me finish my speech. Wise Star Order drifted like a speeding bullet through the endless depths of space. It wouldn't be until a long while later he finally came to a stop on a planet with force so that he could finally be reborn and become the god that he was always meant to. The so-called spark of the dimensional verse was another bastardization of a concept that existed in wider existence. It could even be said that it was only half of the puzzle, the existence of savants being the other half. There was only one problem. In order to touch on to all of this strength, you had to die first. No one knew why this was. Some speculated that it was because you had to come into contact with the first dimension in order to display your full strength. Others said that the body could only stimulate its greatest potential when it had been pushed over its limits. Others said that this was simply a reflection of the ultimate force manipulation, a state where you were able to reach enlightenment of the complete opposite of your path. What could be the opposite of an untimely death if not a life far more bright and blazing than others? It was unknown if anyone would ever find out. But there was one thing that was known for absolute certainty. For every death and revival of a god child, existence would grow one step closer to a forever death. Without fail, every new god child meant the existence of a new timeless event. By now, things might very well be becoming clear to many. Cynthia Oman died and was revived, forming a timeless event. The good news was that Velasco Morales' death had occurred several days afterward and there was hope that it would be considered a different event. The bad news was that Velasco Morales had a great number of ties to Cynthia Oman, and the hatred Cynthia Oman held for Velasco was maybe one of the few things that actually drove her. Ana's mother couldn't be revived even by Anastasia due to their connection. Compared to the seventh dimension, the birth of a god child was so impossibly beyond that it was impossible to put into words. Anastasia, the world spirit of a complete world, could not revive Ana's mother because this fallen woman's daughter had entered the seventh dimension. Cynthia Oman was a god child. Even those with faint connections to her would be out of Anastasia's reach. And as for Velasco, even existence itself wouldn't be able to bring him back as it inched toward destruction. Chapter 2257. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10 and 12 seconds AM. Chapter 2257. Farewell. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again in a location separate from time and space. A man sat. His face was hard to see, but it didn't seem to be because he made any attempt to hide it. it was rather that the dream force radiating from him was too strong. It made him look more like a dense mass of potential rather than what he truly was, a man that had reached the limit of all things. Sometimes, he too forgot who he was, not that it mattered much to him. He had reached the pinnacle of the world, but he had lost everything along the way. His father, his mother, the love of his life, his brothers. One by one, they left him, all so that he could sit here, at the end of existence itself. This was the only location in the world that remained whole. While he was thinking about his family, everything else had already crumbled. There was no more concept of family, no more concept of personhood, or life, even. He should probably be dead too, but he was strong enough to resist things that others could not. It was quite amusing, actually. It was only because he was here that the world couldn't be erased and start anew. Not until all things faded away, until there was nothing left to destroy, until destruction itself reached its very limits, could creation bloom once again. His home of Earth had called it the Big Bang. He had heard it called several things throughout his life. He had too many different names for things floating around his mind. He hoped to actually forget some of them, not that his mind would allow it. An infallible memory was probably the wish of many. None of them thought about what kind of curse it was, though. He envied that master of his. He had experienced so many years of life that he had even forgotten his own name. Ah, to forget, what a wonderful thing. The faceless man waved a hand, a bottle appearing. The world around him trembled with rage and squeezed down, but he ignored it as though existence itself was just a child throwing a tantrum. It didn't like the fact things were still being created. Just this bottle of liquor had cost him half his remaining strength to conjure. He took a swig of the strongest alcohol left, staring into the northern star ahead. He had never liked alcohol very much. He avoided it. He liked having perfect control of himself at all times. The idea of a substance that could alter his perfect thought filled him with disgust. He hated it. And yet here he was, allowing it as part of his final meal. Disgusting, he muttered. Can never tell why men like this so much. I much prefer those fruity drinks. He waved his hand again and pina colada appeared in place of the bottle of hard liquor. This time, existence didn't protest, probably because he had changed what he had already created instead of creating more. It was a nice little loophole. Compared to the first that had taken half of what he had, this time it wasn't even a drop in the ocean. His deep well of force was so vast that he could probably consume this northern star before him. Not that he cared to. What would be the point? Was there something beyond this star? They say that it represented existence, but what did that even mean? The human consciousness was so frail, it couldn't fathom something like this, and even now, having shed all that weakness, it overloaded his mind to think about it, maybe because he knew the answer. He was the only one with the strength to go beyond this northern star, to see what was behind it. He had given everything he had to see his loved ones again, twisted fate and time in all kinds of ways. He had thought that maybe, just maybe, if there was something beyond this world, something stronger, something beyond even himself, he could finally do it. He just wanted that chance. He was certain that even if he popped into a world where even he was somehow the weakest ant of the hill, he could climb to the top once again, then he might be able to finally see those faces again, those smiles. He took a sip of his pina colada. Delicious, he said with a smile, taking another sip. A hand reached up to his face, pushing up what seemed to be a pair of glasses. Who knew why a man of his stature needed such a thing? It didn't seem to make much sense, but he didn't care to remove them. These glasses and himself were the only things that had made it to the end of all things. You're a funny joke, you know that? He laughed, raising his glass to the northern star. Did I reach the top of the world? Or was that always you? There was no response. Of course there was no response. The northern star wasn't a person, it had no will, no intelligence. And beyond it, there was absolutely nothing. He remembered how he had felt the first time he learned that vast emptiness in his chest, as though existence was telling him that there was nothing more to chase, and he had already left behind everything that would have made this painful life of his worthwhile. But worse than that, it was frustration of not understanding, frustration of an unanswered question, frustration of a logical inconsistency. N0 Velby 1 and how had existence come to be? How could there be nothing beyond? How could something come from nothing? What caused this repetitive cycle of life and death, of creation and destruction? Why did they exist? It was so frustrating that he laughed, drinking the last of his drink. He could keep existing into perpetuity, looking into this star and staring down the existence that even the gods could do nothing again. Well, he couldn't do anything about it. But it couldn't do anything to him either. But he was tired. Sitting in this very spot, he had tried everything, poured out every potential solution the strongest mind in existence could think of, and it had all never mattered. He was still alone. He tipped the glass one final time and threw it into the air. It didn't last even a second before it was destroyed. You win. I, Lionel Morales, accept my loss. Farewell. There was no fanfare. In one moment, there was a single kernel of life remaining. In the next, there was nothing. Chapter 2258. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:09 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 2258. Youth. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel froze, a discomfort coming from his chest. For some reason, he felt both a lot lighter, a slight hint annoyed, and a huge amount confused. When he checked his surroundings, his pupils constricted and his breath caught in his throat. What just happened? At the speed the segmented cube was moving, they would reach Earth in less than an hour. Anastasia could push it even faster, but that would require personal energy use that extended beyond the force she was pulling from the surroundings, so it wasn't a worthwhile expense. But that wasn't really the point. Because they were moving at such speed, even the slightest deviation could throw them way off course in just a few split moments. He could have allowed Anastasia to pilot things herself, but because he wanted to take his mind off of something, he chose to control the segmented cube himself. 3:29 seconds. There was a gap in his memory of exactly that long, as though he had been reset and rebooted, and no matter how hard he thought, he couldn't understand what had happened. He had only experienced this 2 other times, 3 if he counted his first interaction with Dream Force, while the other 2 times were the only times he had entered that enlightened state. But he was certain that it wasn't that this time, unless that Demoness could. If she could remotely stop him from transforming, could she force him to transform? But for what purpose? He was still in perfect control of himself in both states, there was no purpose other than to spite him. His jaw set. That wasn't beyond that woman in the slightest. Slighting him out of pure spite? It seemed that she might gain a great amount of satisfaction out of doing that. Lionel took a breath and calmed himself. Surprisingly, it happened much faster this time than it had before. He felt more in control of his state of mind, he felt a lot more like himself all of a sudden. He felt that he could shut off the valve of that emotion again, just like he had when Aina left him. It was so easy suddenly. N-O-V-E-L-B-I-N instead of doing so, though, he stopped, falling into a deep silence. He never acknowledged it because he didn't want to. That future version of himself, he chose to see it as just one possibility of many, a possibility that he would surpass. But now feeling the difference in his control over himself, he felt that he had disappeared. It seemed that he had falsely accused the Demoness. Was that why he had lost those few seconds? He had heard of the future affecting the past, but was it supposed to be so exaggerated? He had even thought once that this was simply a quirk, or rather a flaw, of incomplete worlds like this one. He didn't think it would be such a prominent thing in the real world. Lionel sat in silence, closing his eyes after a while and allowing the segmented cube to drift. There was too much he didn't understand. Why did his future self's influence suddenly disappear? And did it actually disappear? Or was it just that deep well of despair that had? He had a feeling that it was just the latter. But that only made it more odd. Why had the despair vanished? Lionel wanted to believe that it was because his future self had finally succeeded, but he felt like that wasn't the answer either. What was there to despair about if you had already given up everything? There was no despair because there was only apathy left. No. Something deeper than apathy. Nothingness. Lionel opened his eyes, a blazing light within. His future self had failed? He didn't care. As far as he was concerned, that wasn't him at all. Lionel's fists gripped the controls before him tightly, suddenly flooring the segmented cube and zipping through the skies. The smoldering smoke coming from his eyes and the bottoms of his feet ebbed again and again until they vanished entirely, a wild grin spreading across his face. He was eager to get home. He would have Anastasia check one more time, and if there were no innate nodes, then he would break free of this simulation. There was no doubt that he would find someone with the innate node he needed in wider existence. Once he saved Aina, he could turn his attention to his father again. A timeless event was all he needed, just one timeless event. Lionel's eyes carried the brightness of youth, a brightness that wasn't worn and torn by the vicissitudes of life. He had the fire and drive of a young man. He felt that everything could be in the palm of his hands so long as he worked hard enough. He would see his queen again. He would see his father again. He would see his family whole again. He raised his head to the skies and roared, having the joy ride of his life. An unknown number of years later, a certain ethereal glabella finally crashed and landed into a barren planet. It was so small that one might assume that it was a moon instead, but it had just enough force for the dim ethereal glabella to finally flash. Very quickly, all the force of this small planet surged toward this small crystal. It was said that all godchilds had their own trials to face in order to successfully awaken. Regardless of what it was, death would always be observed in some form. For wise Star Order, his fate was to drift through the endless depths of space, weathering countless years of torment. The first time he experienced this, it had nearly broken him. But now, he found it to be an interesting journey. It was as though he had lived hundreds of lives, each one just slightly different from the last. At first, he blamed that disciple of his. Due to the nature of his power, he had grown too enlightened to not experience others toying with his timeline. So, every time Lionel tried a new method to save his father, he had to experience this death again. Chapter 2259. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:09 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 2259. Lab setting. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Naked, but happy, wise Star Order stretched himself out, feeling exuberant. He got to experience life again, that much was a small bit of happiness. But then he sighed, remembering how much work he had to do. That brat surpassed me again. I really have to figure out how he does it. Something's not right with that little monster. He had experienced over 1,300 lifetimes due to this quirk of time and his status as a godchild. It was an oddity in the timeline that was caused for reasons that he still wasn't completely certain of. He was sure that disciple of his had an explanation, but what kind of master asked their disciple for pointers? He would rather die. Again. Every time he was revived, he would find new insights, and he would tweak his progression path just a little bit to increase the efficiency. But there was only so much he could do, honestly. He was already in the 8th dimension in this body, so to say that his foundation had already been laid was a huge understatement. But there were obviously ways to overcome this, if not Lionel wouldn't have been able to become so strong either. And he, who had taught and raised that brat a bit, obviously knew his fair share as well. He just had to do it all again. Plus, between now and when he would meet Lionel next, thousands of years would pass, and that was just in this incomplete world. The true first time he met Lionel, the time that occurred before Lionel's first attempt to save his father, happened even longer after that, and it didn't occur in this incomplete world at all. He laughed to himself. He was looking forward to it. Beating down that arrogant little boy was one of the many guilty pleasures he would get to enjoy in this lifetime again. But this time, I won't let you surpass me so easily, wise Star Order thought to himself, a flash blazing in his eyes. He had been carefully preparing himself for this lifetime. There were certain things that those at the very top couldn't see, but those pitiful people at the bottom could see clearly. Of course, if his enemies heard him describing himself in such a way, they'd have him stripped naked, hung upside down, and whipped, and his beautiful, pert bottom would be swollen red. Wise Star Order subconsciously grabbed his own butt, shuddering. I should get to work. I'll need to be strong enough to stop that brat from destroying the world. Years from now, Lionel would most definitely try to trigger that timeless event, and he wouldn't care about the casualties at all. In fact, that was also the first time he met Lionel on the original Timeless. There were some burdens that an elder would have to alleviate from his juniors, and he was determined to take this one on. He shook his head. Where did that brat find an infinity beast, though? My work is cut out for me. With that thought, Wise Star Order put his hands on his hips. It was time he got out of there. As for why he had chosen to change so much about the Luxnix family's true history, maybe only he and that annoying disciple of his knew. The segmented cube shuttle appeared above Earth, and Lionel stepped out. Down below, the Pluto race was still building the pyramids, and up above, the corpse vessel of the Void Beast was still floating aimlessly, the Void race members that had stayed behind waiting for judgment to be cast on them. Lionel looked toward the Void Beast's corpse and took a leap forward, landing on it. The Void race reacted to this quite violently, but remembering how Lionel had been with Ryan, they hesitated. One part wanted to shred this human apart, and another part wanted to appease the Pluto. The two sides of themselves crippled their own movement entirely. Anastasia. The little floating spirit appeared, a hint of surprise. Lionel's voice sounded brighter. You know, you never really explained to me how you work. The fact you're a world spirit makes sense to me, somewhat. But the lab setting and abode setting? Not to mention that odd vessel? What does that have to do with what you are? Anastasia fell into silence for a long time, and then just chose to explain things simply. I'm the world spirit of a complete world that was destroyed by the god beasts of destruction. I should have fallen with my world, but I was saved by the Minerva race. Minerva race? They're similar to the Pluto race, but they were destroyed a long time ago. Anastasia fell into another silence before she continued. They crafted me into this vessel, and the hope was to help their race live, but I wasn't enough and ended up being crippled. I've passed through many hands, dormant, until I was lost and forgotten, eventually falling to this world. Falling, huh? Lionel said. What's that supposed to mean? I don't know. Just sounds suspicious. A treasure like you am not a treasure. Yes, okay, a beauty like you much better. Wouldn't just casually fall to a world like this one. Feels like a scheme. What a stupid scheme, do you not see how valuable I am? Lionel chuckled. That explained his question. The lab setting and abode settings were just add-ons. The main function was probably to turn the power of a complete world toward crafting. In that case, there was a workbench within Anastasia, one of the most valuable tools at a crafter's disposal outside of their world spirit, but he had never realized that. Anastasia herself was probably one of the greatest workbenches in all of existence. I haven't paid nearly enough attention to all the special quirks of the lab setting, especially after your evolutions. What do you have in there that can dissect a corpse? N0 Velbin. Lionel grinned ear to ear. Chapter 2260. Published at 26th of October 2023 11:05 and 17 seconds AM. Chapter 2260. Easy if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Anastasia's brows shot up, then she looked toward the void beast below. Processing materials and alleviating the more troublesome aspects of force crafting like gathering materials, refining them, preparing them, were all matters that the lab setting was created for. But on top of that, it was also a force multiplier. It allowed for experiments on large levels and without even Lionel's input. She had already integrated all of the test subjects of the Violet Force experiments. It was something that came second nature to her. Processing a beast, even if it was a void beast, was well within her power. After all, this void beast had long since died and its vitality had been crushed to a point even these lessers of the void race could stand within it just fine. As a complete world spirit, it was well within Anastasia's prowess. The reason she was a bit shocked was because this wasn't what she had expected Lionel to do. Didn't he plan on passing this down to little Blackstar? Why did he change his mind? Anastasia shook her head, hard. What was she thinking? This was a huge problem, just thinking about this matter. Lionel was already marked by the god races, stealing their ship was tempting fate. They obviously feared the Pluto, not Lionel. Also, it was impossible that they wouldn't fight back against this attempt. They already seemed as though they were ready to fight it out with Lionel to the death, just overhearing this conversation. These might be servants of the Void race, but many of them were actually stronger than Shanrei and El Ryan. After all, those two were exceptionally young, while they had already matured. They were on an unfathomable level in comparison to a human. Of course, that also meant that if they used their strength the regulator would react, and unlike their entity, they wouldn't be able to escape it so easily. In fact, it could be said the only thing protecting them from such a fate was the Void Beast ship itself, which did wonders for masking presences. Everything about Lionel's intentions sounded wild and ridiculous. But by this point, Anastasia was used to it. She mostly wanted to know why Lionel didn't want to help little Blackstar out. I would expect a mighty world spirit like yourself to already understand, Lionel said, reading Anastasia's thoughts. Don't you like doing reckless things? Why would I care to consider that stuff? Anastasia huffed. Lionel chuckled, finding it all amusing. Assimilate allowed him to take the strength of an external item and pass it into a living being, whether that be himself, another, or his soul constructs. Breathe allowed him to give life and permanence to an object. That could be done through giving it a soul he commanded, or it could be done by allowing it to integrate with a living being after the use of assimilate. The problem, then, wasn't the powers themselves, but rather the limitations. When he used assimilate on himself, the cost of dream force was higher than when he used it on his soul constructs, and it was even higher when he used it on a living being other than himself. This had been fixed with little Tolly because of Anastasia's help he obviously had access to. But then came the second limitation, what one could handle, or more accurately, what their foundation could in this case. Little Tolly had been in a state of hyper-evolution, preparing to set its foundation by fully integrating itself into the sixth dimension. It couldn't have been a more perfect time to integrate with such a beast, and it gave the little guy a world of benefit. As for little Blackstar, he had already entered the seventh dimension and he was already well into his own path. Although he had integrated with a large portion of Void Beast blood, from what Lionel could tell here, that blood had not only been greatly diluted, but it was a drop in the ocean compared to the true amount of blood this creature had flowing through its veins. If he were to use assimilate and breathe on little Blackstar now, while it might still work, he would lose much more to breathe than he would have had he been just entering the sixth dimension or just deciding on his path. No, Lionel had something different planned. He knew that his king's might lineage factor wasn't infallible and it had its weaknesses. If he wanted to maximize this Void Beast corpse, he had to take it slow and give little Blackstar the chance to slowly change his fate on his own. The little guy had already fallen well behind Lionel, and for a beast that had once almost killed him on their first meeting, he knew that little Blackstar was very much not satisfied with just this. At the same time, the approach may also aid him in helping much more than just little Blackstar as well. Who knew what kind of treasures were hidden within a Void Beast's body? Of course, the Void race probably took out all of the most valuable things before turning it into a ship, but he was already prepared for that reality. A little guy like him was just perfect for the scraps. Lionel grinned again and Anastasia rolled her eyes. What was this guy thinking about now? Then how are you going to take it, then? Cheeky brat. Lionel laughed. How? Elrian. Lionel's voice came out in a roar that sounded like something matched between a dragon's roar and claps of thunder. It boomed so loudly that his throat shredded to pieces, but on the surface he acted as though nothing at all had happened. The infuriated Void race members froze and began to shake in fear. The Pluto race members below froze as well, but they looked up in astonishment rather than fear. A human could speak their language? Lionel strolled in and kicked the Void race members out one by one. They didn't even dare to resist. They suddenly feared slighting Lionel. C. Easy, Novi LB, 1N. Chapter 2261. Published at 26th of October 2023 11:05 and 15 seconds AM. Chapter 2261. A name. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Anastasia watched everything, speechless. She didn't know what to say. That language had frozen even her for a moment. It held the weight of command, and an undeniable majesty. Coming from Lionel, even without his king's might lineage factor activated, it felt as though the shadow of a true king had appeared, albeit it for just a moment. But after a moment, seeing the sneaky smile on Lionel's face, she couldn't help but ask. You. What did you say? Oh, that? Lionel grinned. I said that little boy's name. Anastasia froze. You said a name? Well, yeah. I can't actually speak that language, and if I copied anything else they said, wouldn't it be embarrassing if I said a word like, and, or, they'd laugh me out of the ship. Plus, I assumed that whatever his parents named him meant something bold and powerful. It was impossible for even Lionel to learn an entire language just based off of a short conversation. But, picking out a repeatable series of sounds within that conversation was all too obvious. When Elryan was leaving, they had all saluted him with that sound plus a prefix that he assumed meant something like, young master, or young ruler. By process of elimination, picking out Elryan's name was as easy as breathing. You are unbelievable, Anastasia muttered. I know, right? Pretty Anastasia slapped the back of his head. Not in that way. The void race servants who had been kicked off of the ship quickly felt the suppression of the world around them. They quickly took out several items to fight back against the suppression, and unlike the individuals who had come down from the four great families, the black chains didn't appear around them. Clearly, whatever items they had taken out to protect themselves were far beyond what the four great families had had. They looked around in fear, but seeing that no one came for them, they took out other treasures and began to escape quickly one after another. Lionel rubbed the back of his head. I don't know how a race like that can be so cowardly. I don't know what you're so angry about. When have I ever been wrong? Would you like me to list them one by one? In alphabetical or chronological order? Lionel was stunned. This was very much not the response he had expected. But, just as quickly, his one mind began to subconsciously form the list and he had to shake his head to get it to stop. By then, he was already one longer than he cared to admit. Never mind. After a while, Anastasia burst out with laughter. She laughed so hard that twinkling crystals of blue came from her eyes. She felt like she was even dying of laughter. A name, they had been scared off by a name, it was cracking her up. The funniest part was that they probably had no idea. She knew a little bit about the Pluto race, mostly due to the Minerva race, and she knew that their language wasn't understood by many outside of their races, and definitely couldn't be spoken by anyone so casually. They had probably run because they thought they had mistaken Lionel's identity. After all, Lionel had been expelled from Elryan's body. Who knew if he was closer to the Pluto race than he seemed? Just imagining someone screaming, Lionel, in English and then scaring off a race of gods was killing her. Lionel smiled. When you're done, we should probably get going in case one of them realizes they've been duped. Anastasia wiped her tears, though they had already long since floated away. NOVE/L/B/I/N. This was a nice idea by you and all, but moving this corpse in isn't exactly easy either, you know. It won't be as difficult as the hourglass because the difficulty is set and won't just infinitely increase, but it's beyond the current you for sure. Isn't that why I asked you if you could process it first? Lionel smiled. Anastasia looked down with a hint of hesitation. Could she? Maybe if she had a few months, probably a few years, actually. That's okay, my favorite water boy is finally here, Lionel perked up. Elryan rushed in from the distance. He was still quite heavily injured and he hadn't fully recovered, but when he heard his name called, he rushed forward with all the speed his could muster. Plutos were the god of gods, so long as their name was spoken in its truest form, no matter the distance, they would hear it. But what Elryan didn't expect was that the person who called out would actually be Lionel? Hey, you're finally here, good. Do me a favor, use that little hourglass thingy to help Anastasia put this corpse inside. Elryan froze and his lip twitched. Hourglass thingy. He had only just learned this language recently, but he was pretty sure Lionel was being absolutely ridiculous again. Wise Star Order streaked across the skies with great speed. This timeline was already long after Lionel would have left this zone, but it had taken him quite a long time to finally revive. It was unknown whether all god-childs would definitely revive, but it was also obvious why. Those that were dead couldn't exactly tell tales, now could they? But Wise Star Order theorized that so long as a god-child died with an intact ethereal glabella, and around enough force, they would most definitely come back. Every time he died and Lionel did something dangerous, it was becoming more and more difficult to make sure his ethereal glabella remained protected, but this was a master's duty to his disciple. Ah, finally back. Wise Star Order looked down toward the devastation of planet Luxnix, Viola, and Montex. He remembered how heart-wrenching it had been the first time he saw it, but now he was simply numb. On the bright side, his wife survived in this timeline. On the unfortunate side, how would he sleep around now? He descended, his mind swirling with thoughts. Chapter 2262. Published at 26th of October 2023 11:05 and 12 seconds AM. Chapter 2262, Put Me Down. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Wise Star Order chuckled to himself. He didn't know why he was thinking about that woman. Which life was it that he learned how she betrayed him? He was a Wise Star Order, and that sounded great. But compared to a Northern Star Order, it was worth next to nothing. The reality was that the truth of namesakes of the Luxnix family was much deeper than others knew, and it was something that Wise Star Order had allowed to be buried. Wise Star Orders were the bookkeepers and zookeepers of the god beasts of creation. It was their job to document all of the races, worlds, and natural phenomena of existence, not to mention taking care of all species. There was a time where the god beasts of creation had at least one pairing of every plant and animal to ever exist. Of course, that catalog had long since been destroyed, but the ultimate purpose of Wise Star Orders was their mental capacity to remember a lot of things, that was all. So, one could imagine why it was Wise Star Order's wife who was the matriarch and de facto leader of the family, and not himself. Northern Star Orders were the true warriors. They were existences that, so long as they came into contact with an adequate well of light and star force, would be guaranteed to touch upon the golden tablet and claim the truest lineage factor of the infinity beasts. Of course, in this incomplete world, you would be more likely to enter the ninth dimension without the regulator striking you down than you would be to find a strong enough well of force. Even in complete worlds they were nigh unheard of, mostly destroyed by the god beasts of creation. Not that Wise Star Order would ever allow a Northern Star Order to take such a step even if they had such a thing available, that would be nothing short of suicide. If the other races knew that humans still had this capability, the small quarter that they had been given to continue to live as a race would be crushed. It could be said that this was the most foolish thing a human could do in this day and age. And then there was Snow Star Order. This was actually the fault of the English language, the translation wasn't nearly bold or sharp enough. Snow referred now to one of ice water, but rather one of soot and ash. Snow Star Orders were the executioners and messengers of the infinity beasts, and they were meant to remain as snowy star owls. Compared to other humans, they could exhibit much more of the snowy star owl's real strength, and they too could cross a galaxy with a single flap of their wings. Unfortunately, none of the techniques that Wise Star Order had left behind had allowed the Snow Star Order of Lionel's time to display any of that power, which led to her dying at the hand of Velasco. Then again, Wise Star Order thought to himself, knowing that man, he probably had enough strength to deal with the situation regardless. It was a shame that such a monster was born in this incomplete world. Of course, he too was born here. But unlike Velasco, his Luxnix family didn't originate in this world, and he also knew how to get out. And with the project abandoned and the Shadow Tales gone, he could leave with his own methods whenever he wanted. But first, he had a treasure vault to leave behind in the spiritual's domain. Was it smart to give this kind of strength to the very disciple he would have to kick the ass of in a few millennia? No. Definitely was not. But he would do it anyway because this was how the first timeline had gone. N-O-V-E-/LB-I, and originally, he had left that treasure vault behind in the spiritual's domain out of sentiment. He knew what was coming and he had a fondness for the human race. Plus, he was leaving behind some of his Luxnix family, so he hoped that they would be able to benefit from his teachings. As for why he had left it in the spiritual's domain and not the human domain, it was a test. If the people of this incomplete world wanted any chance of crossing the coming trial, they had to at least dominate this incomplete world, or else they wouldn't stand a chance against the others. Very soon, the vast bubble would run out of time and they would have to cash in on the bet that the Fox had made. In a final push, they would pit the juniors of the incomplete worlds against one another, taking advantage of the time dilation for one final spurt of accelerated growth. Incomplete worlds were like rolls of the dice. There would be many that evolved down a path far weaker than the dimensional verse, but there would be some that had evolved in special niche ways that placed them on par with even some complete worlds despite lacking the ability to take the final step into the ninth dimension. These latter worlds were what the vast bubble were banking on. They wanted warriors that would be useful, and the dimensional verse was far too weak. And then, once they gave them a path to the ninth dimension, they would have these warriors in the palm of their hands forever. Velasco was supposed to become one of these warriors, but he had grown too powerful on his own. As for whether they would allow the son of such a man to live, well, Wise Star Order laughed into the skies as he landed in the courtyard of his and his wife's abode. That brat was harder to kill than a roach, had find a way, probably. The only question was how many would die before he did find that path. The answer to that question was more important than anything else. XXX? You're here? Wise Star Order's mind seemed to filter out his name naturally. At this point he felt that he did it on purpose. Seeing the face of the woman he knew would betray him, and just how gorgeous, and equally annoying she was, he felt an amused thought bubble up as a bulge in his pants shifted. The matriarch of the family looked as though she was about to launch into a lecture. She had only married Wise Star Order because he was the most eligible bachelor, but she usually took out the stress of her position on him. Wise Star Order had never been a pushover, but he couldn't defeat this wife of his in the past either, so it was useless. Now, though, Wise Star Order took a step forward and grabbed her by the waist, howling her over his shoulder and storming into their bedroom. XXX. You put me down. The protests were soon drowned out by dense cries for mercy filled with a lustful undertone. Wise Star Order had an excellent time subduing this wife of his. It wouldn't change much about the future, but he didn't care for it to. It would be even more interesting later. His life was just getting started. Chapter 2263. Published at 26th of October 2023 11:05 and 11 seconds AM. Chapter 2263. Creation tablet. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Wise Star Order stood with a stretch, sliding his robes on. Ah, it was good to be young. Last time he had gone so hard, his back had ached for days. He ignored the limpid words of his wives. She was hardly intelligible, her speech slurring and her eyes half closed. She was probably saying something about why he wasn't staying in bed, but it was more funny than anything to him. Before this day, he had bedded this woman a single time, and she hadn't even let him finish. She only did it out of a sense of duty and to officially consummate their marriage. Of course, the most important reason was because of her ability index. She had been trying to take on his Wise Star Order abilities for herself. As much as he would like to play with this heartless woman some more, he had some work to do. Right, valiant heart. Wise Star Order took a step as his wife's gargled mess of words were becoming sharper and louder. He luckily didn't get to listen to whatever nonsense she was definitely trying to spew. Instead, he had appeared deep within the catacombs of the Luxniks. These catacombs were built by the envoys of the god beast of destruction. There hadn't been an active void beast in countless generations, but that didn't stop the creature's lessers from doing their best to stir up trouble. Despite their usual brazenness, they were somewhat cautious in this world. That was because of the appearance of the Pluto race, and its relation to the existence of these incomplete worlds was something worthy of being wary of. The void bubble was far too weak to even have a single incomplete world for this sort of experiment, let alone dozens. It could only be done by the god races. But at the same time, this world was too valuable precisely because of its variability and potential for evolution. It was the perfect place to experiment with a new force. Since the experiment was a failure, and a youth of the Pluto race had appeared, they chose to abandon it. The place had already been stripped bare by Lionel, but why would they care so much about failures? No, it was probably more accurate to say that they couldn't spare the risk and the failures weren't valuable enough to put themselves on the line. Wise Star Order appeared in the temple once more. Now, all that remained was a bronze tablet, and he didn't seem surprised. He had allowed Lionel to take the silver and golden tablets. It would be a long while before Lionel could use the latter, so he wasn't worried. Of course, he didn't expect that foolish disciple of his to understand propriety and not use the tablet even when he could, not in this state anyway. That was Lionel's fault. He would be under a lot of pressure soon, and he might take power from anywhere he could. But if he took it from this source, he would only die sooner. Wise Star Order stepped forward and toward the bronze tablet. He looked as though he was about to crash right through, but the moment his shin looked as though it would crash into the altar, a ripple of space flashed and he disappeared. The Luxniks would probably rush in soon enough, but find nothing at all. The space-wise Star Order appeared and was a vast darkness. There was only one thing floating in silence, a single tablet, a single silver tablet. He reached forward and grabbed the creation tablets. NOVE/L-B-I/NAS. A wise Star Order, he had a duty to these tablets. Bronze, silver, golden and... He waved the hand with the silver tablet in it and its body rippled, the words on its surface forming into a force art that rolled and foamed with light until it became a blinding crystal color. Star Crystal. The crystallization of the purest, attributeless star force. It was the energy that was the very foundation of existence itself. He might be a glorified librarian, but the books he oversaw were far beyond the imagination of most individuals. In incomplete world, even a silver tablet like this one had infinite power. It could bend and twist reality as it pleased and had very few restrictions. To the god beasts of creation, though, this was simply a simulator. It was used to document experiments. It was these creation tablets that were the center that allowed the god beasts of creation to succeed in passing down their bloodlines to humans, and all the while, they killed not a single person thanks to it. It's a decent gift, Wise Star Order thought to himself. He'll be pretty aimless in his life because of the influence of his future self. Why chase anything when you feel like you have already achieved everything? This should help him get a taste of what it means to have drive and purpose. It'll make the moment his future self vanishes more manageable as hell have his own sense of self. But this isn't quite enough. Wise Star Order stroked his chin. Lionel had no idea that his master, a master he didn't even know he had and wouldn't acknowledge until years later, was diligently laying out a plan for his improvement step by step. However, that wouldn't stop Wise Star Order from being as diligent as he could. Right, I'll use this to influence a few zones, then. He shook the silver tablet again and it went back to normal as he vanished. Streaking across the skies, he felt leisurely, a smile on his face. He guessed that he owed his disciple a small bit of advantage. He had made it so far without any, so Wise Star Order wanted to see what he would accomplish now. Wise Star Order appeared above Earth, prepared to make some alterations to the timeline. Enough time had passed that the Plutos had long since gone and Earth was slowly building up its own civilizations. Interestingly enough, the true history of Earth seemed to be completely wrong, not that that mattered. Ah, right, I need a name. I can't exactly use Wise Star Order, 2 on the nose. HM. He looked at the tablet. Ah, what was it that stupid woman kept calling me? Nilrem, right? Alright, let's go with Merlin, then. Chapter 2264. Published at 26th of October 2023 11:05 and 11 seconds AM. Chapter 2264. Maze or if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2264. Maze or Lionel appeared back in his timeline. His gains this time were quite great. He had gained the odd beast that fused with little Tolly, he had gained a void beast's corpse, and his vital star force had taken a half step into the impetus state. Beyond that, he had been informed about a great many things and even gained the silver and golden tablets. He wasn't too eager to pass down those 2 tablets to the Luxniks. They had had them for so long back then and accomplished nothing. Giving it to them now wouldn't magically change anything except for his grandmother. Even so, he was hesitant to give it to her either. He had too many questions for that grandfather of his, and his grandmother was practically wrapped around his finger. He was very good at reading people, and he could tell that his grandmother was entirely googly eyes for the Ascension Empire's emperor. She would stand on his side almost no matter what. In a situation like that, he wasn't sure what to think. Did he hate his grandfather? No. Did he distrust him? Not exactly, though it was close enough to that. Did he want to take unnecessary risks? Also no. So he kept it to himself. Instead, rather than returning to the Morales family, he was far more interested in 2 things. First, Anastasia's second search, and the second, and also the reason they returned home so easily, he wanted to fully understand little Tolly, or at least understand him to the greatest extent he could. He stood in a familiar location of the lab setting. It was the first room that had ever formed. His simple workbench ahead, the walls were lined with snow globes and simple shelves. This was the room that he had learned to craft in, the room he had started the first of his father's lessons and gained an understanding toward how he should treat his spirit partner. He sat at the bench and pointed out a hand. Little Tolly stretched out, peeling off of his skin and forming a perfect ball. Silver was still the little guy's main color, but the dense runes of white gold that made his head dizzy to look at. Little Tolly rolled on the table between Lionel's fingers, making booping sounds that made it seem like it was having a great deal of fun. Interesting. Spirits usually choose a favored form and even a gender after entering the 6th dimension, but little Tolly has done neither, choosing to stay like this. Is this because of the way I evolved him? Is it because of the best he assimilated? Or is there another reason? Tolliver should have a perfect fusion of all paths. There was a refinement path, a creation path, a universal force path, and of course the jack of all trades. The first allowed the ease of processing of ores, but not just this alone. This seemed to sound like a spirit would just clear an ore of impurities for you, but it was deeper than that. When one had entered the life grade, you began to appreciate the intricacies of each and every ore. Even when they shared the same name, they weren't exactly equal, and you had to account for all of these little changes when you wanted to create something whole and new, something that had a life of its own. This path was like a cheat code to the life grade. Rather than relying on your personal skill to learn and adapt, you could rely on your spirit instead to force the ores into a predictable path. This lowered the bar to forge life grade crafts considerably. You only had to worry about the blueprint and not the whims of nature. This was the first thing Lionel tested. He took out an ore that went by Maze Oregon. It was a light domain type ore that could project a large amount of illusions as it refracted the light around it. It was an interesting ore he had been playing around with, as he thought it would be interesting to form a troop around this kind of armor. OVL/BI/N however, it was very difficult to work with despite being a 6th-dimensional Oregon. This was because even the slightest deviation in a cut to the ore could drastically change how it warped light around it, and it could trick the eyes of even its crafter and their spirit, so getting precise cuts in the first place was a nightmare. It was a problem ore that most completely ignored. Only those with exceptionally high light force affinity could hope to deal with it, and it was rare enough to have an affinity of such a rare force to begin with, let alone having the skill in crafting to match it. Unless, of course, you had a dream world like Lionel. This ore could fool even internal sight, but what it couldn't fool was Lionel's dream world. Even so, there were other problems aside from trying to get perfect cuts, and that was related to the actual and slight differences between the force densities of the ores themselves. Even if he cut them perfectly, these small differences would throw him for a loop. He held out 2 maize ores and handed them to little Tolly with a simple command: make them identical in every way. To Lionel's surprise, little Tolly only tapped each one of them once, then went back to rolling around and having fun. Lionel's brows shot up before he deployed his dream world. He sat in silence for a long time. He scanned everything about the ore, the cuts, the force balance, the size, the weight. He didn't miss a single detail, even down to its chemical structure. It shouldn't have been anywhere near that fast. Chapter 2265. Published at 26th of October 2023 11:05 and 9 seconds AM. Chapter 2265. Lighthouse, or if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2265. Lighthouse, or little Tolly, was supposed to be a jack of all trades but master of none. However, this speed was even faster than a true master of this purification path should have found possible. He didn't have much of a reference outside of what he had read in the Void Library, but he was certain of this. It wouldn't have been a surprise even if it took days, and the spirit in question should have had to swallow the ores first, process them, and then expel them, not just tap them once. Lionel knew that the beast would cause some great changes in little Tolly, and he even expected that the little guy would be more of a master than he knew. But this was greatly exaggerated. Of course, the ores weren't perfect. He only commanded little Tolly to make them identical, but he didn't specify how, or what parameters he wanted. So, he assumed that the little metal spirit had chosen the easiest path, and not the path best for his army, but he didn't care very much. He took another ore. This one was another 6th-dimensional ore, and it was a vein type or that directly light force. It could be used to dampen and expand the maze force of the maze ore, shrouding a much larger area than that of the troop with the maze armors, or it could be used to do the opposite and shrink the illusions to contend against a small number of enemies or even one powerful enemy. This vein type ore was known as lighthouse ore. It was the best ore in this category at controlling light force. The reason for its necessity was quite obvious. Maze ore, once its cuts were set, could be confusing to look at, but not much about it would change over time, and it lacked flexibility. This would fix all of that. However, Lionel felt it would be better if they were the same ore, containing the characteristics of control and confusion. Of course, that was easier said than done. Lionel had never bothered because, considering all the effort it would take, he might as well just forge the both of them into a life-grade armor. It would be the same thing, mostly. Unless the second path of the spirits allowed one to fuse ores into one, creating all new effects and combining abilities. This was yet another cheat code of the life grade, making the ores perfect for crafting into a holistic and whole form. I haven't studied these two enough. I need a third maze or dash, Lionel mumbled to himself, prepared to take out a third, but then he froze. Little Tolly's white gold runes lit up and a maze or suddenly spit out from thin air. There was only the slightest fluctuation of force in the surroundings, as though the little one was pulling on something, and then it appeared, just like that, in a flash of light. Lionel reached forward, slowly picking the ore up. It was a maze ore, perfect and whole. He squeezed it and it was crushed between his palms. Everything about it was exactly the same, even the resistance. It wasn't an illusion at all, or else he would have sensed the dream force by now. He looked toward little Tolly. I need another. Little Tolly didn't think much, making a cute bloop sound and forming another. Lionel picked it up and he was completely shaken. This one was slightly different from the last one, and the last one was slightly different from the two that he had originally given little Tolly. I need a lighthouse, Oregon. Little Tolly sat in silence for a while, confused. Then, suddenly being enlightened, it reached forward and touched the lighthouse ore in Lionel's hand quickly, then pulled back, acting innocent before it flashed with light. A perfectly whole lighthouse ore appeared, slightly different from the one in Lionel's hands. little Tolly didn't even seem to be struggling at all. N Lionel immediately put the little metal spirit through a countless series of tests, pushing the little one to the limits, or so he tried. Nothing he did seemed to tire little Tolly out at all. He assumed that it was because he didn't go far enough, but this alone was shocking. Little Tolly could perfectly replicate or at the 6th dimension and below without much effort at all. It was completely stonewalled when it came to higher ores, and it more so seemed like a yes or no switch rather than an effort switch. Each time he created one, he pulled from the force in the surroundings, causing each one to be just a little bit different, just like real ores you would find in a mine. What was more shocking than that was that after creating the new ore, a fusion of maze ore and lighthouse ore, little Tolly became like a database, remembering the new ore and being able to create it even without the 2 base ores any longer. There wasn't even a point in testing the third path, that of using universal force to supplement crafting, because Lionel could already feel it passively when Tolliver stuck to his arm. But he chose to do so anyway, just to cover all of his bases, and this was maybe the most shocking of them all. When he used universal force through Tolliver, he could sense something beyond, or maybe it was on par, he wasn't entirely sure. It was like he could touch upon the veil of the world and he discovered something absolutely shocking. He could sense the constellations of the dimensional verse. Those of the human domain, those beyond the human domain, it didn't seem to matter in the slightest. Not only could he sense them, but he could use little Tolly as a bridge, connecting to them, and using these constellations to directly power his creations. The implications of such a thing were beyond what Lionel could even fathom currently, especially once he stepped outside of this verse. As he was thinking, Anastasia's voice drifted to his ear. "I'm sorry, Lionel, there is no such innate node in this time either." Erdiel's note, off course, LOL. Chapter 2266. Published at 26th of October 2023 11:05 and 8 seconds AM. Chapter 2266. A suit if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 2266. A suit. Lionel fell into silence for a moment before he closed his eyes and exhaled a slow breath. When he opened them again, there was a resolute look within. The plan remained the same. Crush this dimensional verse into his fists as quickly as possible, open a path to the outside world, and if he was lucky enough to enter the impetus state before then he would forget about this matter. If he wasn't, then he didn't believe in the whole of wider existence there wasn't at least one such person. He didn't care how powerful they were, what their background was, if it would save Aina, he would do it. With me, Tolliver. Well, finish this within a day with your help. The sound of popping bubbles and bubbling water echoed. It sounded much more complex than the noises little Tolly usually made, and Lionel even felt that he could even somewhat understand the little metal spirit far better. While it hadn't seemed to mature exactly as he had expected, it had definitely still matured. Confidence and excitement radiated from Tolliver, and Lionel even felt like the metal spirit was a miniature version of himself, at least somewhat. Good. Lionel got to work. A day later, he stepped out from the lab setting, sharp-eyed and radiating a suppressive aura. The first thing he did was go and speak to his mother. After confirming that she had already formed the Golden Tiger lineage factor, he asked her to follow him. It was about time they returned to the Morales family and saw what the situation was. Not much time had passed. The time allocated for the mission within the zone should have taken years to finish, and the time dilation was, as a result, quite forgiving. Due to this, Lionel and his mother had only been inside for a few minutes. Overall, it was only a single day if his time spent crafting was. On that day, not only had he completed the final sets of armor for his demon troops, but he had also reformed his divine armors, again. "If you want to return to the Morales family, you can't wear that," Eleanor suddenly said as Anastasia set off. Lionel looked down at himself. His robes were decent enough, though not as elaborate as the ones he had worn to match Aina as they entered the air wars. But they were still decent enough. He had wanted to wear his sweatpants, but he felt that he should be a bit more mindful of his image. That said, He wasn't exactly in tune with the fashion sense of the wider dimensional verse, he just randomly picked something out. Now that he thought about it, it was Aina who had decided on their matching robes as well. He was much better at designing cool uniforms, but now wasn't the time for that. N.O/V.E-L-B-I, and Eleanor shook her head and patted Lionel's cheeks. I didn't want to overstep my bounds before, but I won't let anyone stop me from being a mom now, not even you. She waved a hand, and a white robe appeared. Lionel's expression became a bit weird. Why white? It wasn't that he hated the color, but he would prefer something bolder. What about black and gold? A nice gray and blue also sounded nice. Don't doubt your mother, little lion. Now come, strip. Lionel's face became weirder. What are you doing? Hurry up now, I haven't got all day. Lionel coughed and stripped off his outer robes. He wasn't a shy person, and had gotten into his fair share of wild battles that had practically left him entirely naked. But for some reason he felt a little uncomfortable standing in front of his mother in his boxers. Eleanor looked at his body and nodded, patting her own shoulder as though she had done a great job. Lionel's physique had already been exceptional ever since he entered the fourth dimension. He had gone from an elite athlete to a man that seemed more like a fitness model than anything else. But now, whether it was in vascularity, leanness, or definition, he was levels above. She threw a pair of white pants and robes at Lionel. When Lionel caught them, he felt that the material was incomparably soft, almost like silk and clouds had a baby. On top of that, looking a bit closer at more than just the color, there were faint patterns of a gray so subtle that it almost looked white as well. But together, the subtle embroidery made it look quite noble and elegant. When he put them on, he was actually quite satisfied. The material even made his force flow with a smoother cadence. He made a mental note to study up on fabrics and how he could incorporate them into his crafts. His father's teachings had had sewing lessons, but he hadn't applied them anywhere but the beast skin armors he had made for his companions during the Void Palace True Selection. However, his mom didn't seem to be finished. She had yet to help him accessorize. By the time Lionel was done, he was wearing a golden chain around his neck and wrist, the latter of which was just barely hidden beneath his love sleeve, and the former of which was just as subtle beneath his collar. His hair was slicked back in a formless gel that he couldn't even feel, and he actually wore shoes for a change. His white suit with faint gray embroidery reminded him of an Indian-style suit, a Jodhpuri if his memory hadn't failed him. As for his mother's nods of satisfaction, they were even more exaggerated. Now, your father's glasses, Eleanor commanded. Lionel froze, but his mother's tone didn't seem to leave room for negotiation. With a deep breath, he slipped them on, and Eleanor beamed. There's my little lion. Go on now. Lionel shifted the crystal-framed glasses on his face and then stepped out, a vibrant violet color in his eyes. When he stepped out, he found the Morales family in chaos. Chapter 2267. Published at 26th of October 2023 11:05 and 2 seconds AM. Chapter 2267. Gifts. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2267. Gifts. The Morales family wasn't under attack, at least not officially. Rather, the ships of several powers were in the surroundings. Each one had come with gifts, these gifts being Lionel's demands of them in exchange for the lives of their juniors. Due to the matters that had happened the moment the air wars ended, they hadn't had time to gather up these materials. But Lionel's ability to read the intentions of people, and further these powers, only got sharper the stronger his mind became. He could see the difference between those that had come with the intention of actually paying up, and those that expected the gesture alone to be enough. The Morales family elders had simply said that Lionel wasn't here, but how could these people believe that? So, they had started pressing, leaving their warships up in the air around the Morales capital. Of course, if it was aggressive enough for a war declaration, the Morales would have never come this far, but the intention was obvious enough. However, as bold as the threat was, Lionel's lip curled. He could sense the hesitation, the fear, and why shouldn't they have such reservations? The momentum of the Morales was unlike anything they had ever seen. If not for his father's death, maybe they wouldn't even dare to do this much. This was a test. They wanted to see how much they could push the Morales. As Lionel walked toward the capital, his mother a half step behind him with a doting and caring expression on her face, his presence seemed to loom, becoming taller and taller until the world fell into its own sort of silence. The engines of the warship still blared, the raging winds caused by their presences, and the distortions in gravity were still heavy. However, in the end it still felt as though there was only one person that could be focused on. The members of the Morales who were just passively observing this situation from the outside, not quite knowing of the internal conflict between Lionel and their own elders, felt a sense of pride well up in their hearts. This was the champion of the air wars. Not just any air war, but an unprecedented air war that would be remembered for generations, a man that stood atop the strongest collection the human domain had seen since its inception. And he was a Morales. He was their patriarch. The will of the Morales seemed to solidify, and the flickers of their constellation in the sky dimmed the momentum of the surrounding families considerably. The faces of their messengers fell. Never did they expect that the appearance of just one person would have such a profound effect on the situation, but they steeled their hearts. They had already expected much of this, though not all of it. It was the reason for their partial caution in the first place. But even so, they still represented the whole of the human domain, and even the Suyard family and the spirituals' religion had suffered at the hands of Lionel, not to mention the Omen family. 3 organizations and families, all on the same level as the Morales, had come for compensation. No matter what the future of the Morales looked like, it was still the future and not the present. It was impossible for them to have taken full benefit from their constellation and new lineage factor already. This was their best chance to suppress them. The so-called messengers were all among the strongest these families could call forward without sending their ancestors. If they sent their ancestors, it would have a much different connotation, and they didn't want to take that step just yet. Instead, they sent the very strongest of their 7th-dimensional elites. The constellation families, the Constellation Bao Alliance, the Suyard, the Omen, the spirituals' religion, but they were just the beginning. Once again, the smaller families became a pawn in the game of the big wigs, countless smaller 7th-dimensional families, and even a minority of 6th-dimensional families, appearing as well. They all had the intention of stepping off their ships and questioning Lionel directly, but the latter waved a hand. Nove LB/1 All of a sudden, the strength of the world trembled and their ships were locked in place, all of the force arts no longer responding to their call as though they were cut off from the laws of the world. Guests should wait to be invited in. You wouldn't want to be rude, right? Lionel asked lightly. The messengers froze as Lionel strolled into the planet-swallowing palace of the Morales. Within, the elders were in heated discussion. They hadn't even gotten time to implement many of Lionel's changes before this happened. They all realized they hadn't improved nearly enough yet. While their pride wanted to fight it out with the rest of the human domain immediately, the cost of this was heavy, especially since they had already sent much of the evacuees back to their homes due to Lionel's orders. If not for Lionel's almost blinding presence, they wouldn't have even noticed someone enter, something that was a hint embarrassing. Some found themselves subconsciously exhaling when Lionel appeared before catching themselves. Since when had they trusted this brat so much? He hadn't proven anything but how rude he was. Lionel scanned the region, but the Overlord was nowhere to be seen. Ancestor Isa and Ancestor Alvaro seemed to have taken over the proceedings, but because the other families hadn't sent any ancestors, it would be a sign of weakness if they took direct action, so they were trying to find some workarounds. Seeing Lionel, the two had their own complicated set of reactions, but in the end, they exhaled. Patriarch. They greeted at the same time. Of course, they weren't unduly respectful. The word patriarch coming from them sounded no different than had they said Lionel's name directly. They noticed Alienor as well, but they chose not to say anything. For one, they were quite familiar with Lionel's temper by now, and he might do something ridiculous if they really said something, and secondly, well, she carried the Morales name too. Is there really all that much to talk about? Let them come and bring us great gifts. The expressions of the ancestors and elders changed. Chapter 2268. Published at 26th of October 2023 11:04 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 2268. Junior Ancestors. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. N-O-V/EL/B/1 N. Chapter 2268. Junior Ancestors. The elders were truly stunned by Lionel's words. Their first assumption was that Lionel didn't understand what he was talking about, lacking in too much experience to see what the problem was. Take, for example, two individuals of vastly different standings, one of which was a man of average class and fit well amongst the common people, and the second of which was a noble existence, an emperor or king, even. Would the man of average class be able to make a deal of equal with the king? According to the rules of society, they would be, by their very nature, two existences of vastly different worths. Making a deal of equals first necessitated being equals in the first place. A king could order a man of average class to do as he pleased, the vice versa would ever be true. How this applied to the current situation was obvious. The Morales might be a king if it was dealing with any one family, but the problem was that it wasn't dealing with one family or even one organization, it was dealing with the entire human domain. How could they match up? What did it mean to make a deal of equals? It meant that if one party should default on their word, the consequences the opposing party could force them to pay would be too great for them to ignore. This would force both parties into upholding their word. What could a man of average class do to a king? And in this situation, in an exchange of life for treasure, if these families defaulted on their words, they would lose one genius, true enough. But they would also be able to gain a reason to retaliate in kind. But what about the Morales? If Lionel didn't follow through, then he would bring down the wrath of the entire human domain on the Morales. This was fundamentally not a deal of equals. So when Lionel spoke of just accepting the gifts, it sounded like a joke, like a peasant trying to force the hand of a king to give him treasures for doing something easily within his power. However, Lionel didn't seem to notice their reactions at all. He walked forward, taking his seat at the helm, his mother standing to his back, though only for a moment. At an unknown time, a flash of green surrounded Eleanor and she vanished into thin air as though she had never been there. It was impossible to tell if she was still behind Lionel, or if she had gone off to some other place. Lionel smiled. Ancestor Isa, Ancestor Alvaro, I'll have to ask you two to leave. Our guests have only brought forward 7th dimensional experts. It would be beneath your station to appear here, no? Leave this matter for a junior like me. The eyes of the two ancestors flickered. Lionel's words just now was probably the nicest thing he had ever said to them. Well, it was at the very least not as rude as the usual. But it was clear what his intentions were. If they really left, then what happened from here on would be dictated entirely by Lionel's temper, and they didn't know if they could trust such a thing. However, what they didn't expect was that they wouldn't get a chance. Lionel tapped a finger subtly after he spoke, and the world's power descended. In the eyes of others, it looked as though the two had disappeared under their own power. The other ancestors looked toward one another and one by one, they too vanished. Lionel radiated a confidence that left the remaining elders a bit stunned. In the end, they too took deep breaths and found their positions, taking a seat. Elder Chris. A middle-aged woman with a stern face and short-cut hair stood immediately. Yes, Patriarch. Lionel tapped his armrest for a moment, in thought. Do we have any promising youths in this coming generation? Elder Chris was one of the head commanders of the Divine Guards and also one of the strongest among the peak 7th dimensional Morales. For those like this, the Morales had their own unique names for them, and they called this group of elders the Junior Ancestors, though there was nothing junior about them at all. She would be among the best in knowing what promising youths there were, at least in combat. The Morales had yet to get used to the fact that the spear domain lineage factor and the metal synergy lineage factor had now become one. Among the post-Nova generation, there are indeed a few good seedlings, she nodded in affirmation. Pick one, call them here, Lionel said. Her gaze flickered, but Lionel had already moved on. Elder Arya. Yet another older woman stood, straight and tall. She didn't look nearly as stern, but there was still a hint of authority between her brows. Her hair was long and tinged with deep hints of silver that alternated with the usual deep brown of the Morales, and from her neck hung a pair of glasses. She was one of the head crafters and led the crafters of the family in many things. She wasn't a junior ancestor in raw strength, but rather in the power of her divine armor and how cleverly she implemented her crafts. In this way, she was a lot like the Radix family, but on a completely different level. Unlike Elder Chris, though, she didn't call out to him as patriarch, not that there was a rule for this. Do the same as Elder Chris, call one here. She frowned. Patriarch, she said slowly, this matter is quite delicate, it isn't very appropriate for. Lionel looked over and met her eyes. Elder Arya could see an almost indifferent sort of gentleness within, but it still froze her. The weight of the world bore down. Inappropriate? I think it will be fine, Lionel said with a smile. We just need a few flower girls and ring boys. The hearts of the elders skipped a beat, but everything was quickly put into motion. Soon, the doors of the Morales Palace were opened wide, and at the forefront, two teenagers, one young man and one young woman, stood forward, their pride beaming and the arrogance of the Morales blooming out from deep within them. The Morales family welcomes you. They roared. Chapter 2269. Published at 26th of October 2023 11:04 and 50 seconds AM. Chapter 2269. Guessed if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2269. Guest Tommy Morales. A bright spark of the Spear faction and a young man of 15 years old with a pair of eyebrows that looked like a flare of fire. His face was just as stern as his instructor's, but the hints of immaturity on his face were clear, but it carried a vibrancy of youth. Nora Morales. A bright light of the crafting faction, she too was 15 years old, and she had an interesting style herself. Her metal spirit held her hair up into two ponytails. It couldn't help but remind Lionel of a certain faction leader from Valiant Heart Mountain. She too used her fire spirit to hold her hair up. It exhibited quite a level of control. But Lionel only smiled when he saw this. Though it was well hidden, he could see a special fabric and clip separate Nora's hair from her metal spirit. It was clear that Lionel was still one of the very few, if not the only one, in the human domain that dared to touch his metal spirit directly. Even so, it still took quite a bit of control to stop her metal spirit from eating through the metal and getting at her hair, which was worthy of a great deal of praise. Together, they were two of the brightest stars of the next generation. Considering their age, it wouldn't even be much more than 5 years before they were meant to participate in the air wars, but the timeline wasn't on their side this time around. The two held up their spears and slammed their butts into the ground, a soaring spear force coming from them. It was quite weak. You couldn't expect much from fifth-dimensional existences like them, and yet. The constellation in the skies appeared once again. Their strength soared, from the fifth dimension, to the sixth, and from the sixth, the seventh, but by the time their spear force reached the height of the surrounding battleships, they sang like a pair of dragons and phoenixes. Shaken, the various family messengers entered the hall one by one. Their edge had been filed down to a dull tip and the hesitation in their steps was clear. The only ones that seemed to carry the same sort of confidence were those of the strongest families, with the standouts being that of the Suyard family, the Spirituals' religion, the Omen family, and a special, unexpected visitor. The Void Palace. Lionel didn't react much to this. The loss of the Void Elders, or at least most of the Void Elders, wouldn't be enough to crumble them entirely. An organization like this would have its trump cards, but even more importantly than that, the Void Palace was the symbol of humanity. Even if it fell, it would be held up by the various families of the human domain. NOVL-B. And of course, whether or not the mission of the palace would stay the same after this, that was a different story entirely. If they were anything more than a puppet, it would be an amusing surprise. The leader of the Void Palace, obviously here to play the role of mediator, was actually quite a young man. Lionel recognized him almost immediately, and he found it even more amusing. This young man was a member of the Unfettered Blade Party, Mykarth. The last time Lionel met him, he was a galaxy-ranked disciple just a couple weeks away from the sector rank. Now, he was nearly a domain-ranked disciple. For the Void Palace to not even send a domain-ranked disciple to mediate the situation was funny enough, but even more importantly than all these other identities. His last name was Suyard. Mykarth had a deep hatred for Lionel. He first found trouble for the latter after his father severed Rosen Suyard's arm, Mykarth's uncle. And it only became personal after Lionel personally defeated him in battle. Honestly, Lionel had to say that Mykarth was the perfect choice. He was the absolute most talented among the Suyard family. That was a title that went to Amory. He wasn't a step below that, as there were 3 others who would have been part of the Suyard family's heir wars that were passed up for Amory. He was just a step below that. He was a great talent, for sure. But he wasn't prominent enough to be said to be a representation of the Suyard family, and he was just talented enough to have a great position in the Unfettered Blade Party and the Void Palace. It would be geniuses like him who likely held up the foundation of the Void Palace now, and in the future, the Void Palace of the past would be no more, controlled like a puppet behind the scenes by these powerful families. In fact, that future might be here already, or else the likes of Mykarth would have never been sent first. Mykarth cleared his throat, a slightly prideful expression on his face with the comfort of his family's backing to support him, but before he could speak, Patriarch Morales has yet to ask you to speak. Please be mindful of your position and only speak when spoken to. Tommy spoke with a crisp voice. While it was slightly immature, it carried the same hints of sternness head commander Chris had. Much like his mentor, he was a stickler for rules and etiquette. He would never allow a guest to speak before his patriarch, nor would he allow his patriarch to have to be the one to correct this guest. He and Nora stood to Lionel's back, one to each side, arms clasped behind their backs. As a pair of youths, they did surprisingly well in this atmosphere, and it was clear that much of their confidence came from the man on the throne before them. The older generation might be hesitant about Lionel, but the feelings of the youth were quite clear when it came to him. He was their idol. Mykarth's face flushed red. Never did he expect to be reprimanded by a child like this, but he also wasn't in a position to argue with one either, especially when said child was in the right. Lionel smiled lightly and slowly opened his mouth. Some thought he might say some fake words to reprimand Tommy, but he did no such thing. Welcome, dear guests. I assume that you've come with the offerings? Chapter 2270. Published at 26th of October 2023 11:27 and 27 seconds AM. Chapter 2270. What cost? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2270. What cost? Lionel's words were grating on the ears. Offerings? It was like he was implying that he was a king and they were his servants come to pay the taxes for a year out of a faint hope that he might give them enlightenment. They had seen Lionel battle, his schemes, his intelligence. There was a next to 0% chance that he had misspoken. He picked this word on purpose. Every step of the way, he was showing his indomitable will. He wouldn't take a step back before these families. Mykarth's expression darkened, but he reined in his distaste. He was already in a partially compromised position, although the Suyard family had sent him here precisely as a show of strength and power. They now had the greatest influence in the Void Palace and the future generations of the human domain's protectors, and no one else could do anything about it. The momentum of the Morales was something they had to cut down at all cost. Although the Omen and Spiritual's religion was seen to be on the same level, the reality didn't exactly play out like that. For one, the most powerful families and organization was 6, not 4. There was still the Void Palace and Shield Cross Stars. Everyone knew that though they were neutral, they could tip the scales whenever they so chose. Secondly, the Omen family had the shield of being a crafter's family and normally stayed out of most conflicts. The air wars was a rare instance of their participation, and it was fairly well acknowledged that this was a combination of both extenuating circumstances, Lionel taking control of both Earth and the Morales, in addition to the scorned Queen Bowtie's more personal feelings. Then there was the spirituals' religion. Their reputation had taken quite some hit after the Emperor of the Spirituals was defeated by Velasco, even while having the aid of so many experts, not to mention the fact that Velasco had very clearly been injured by some mysterious force. This could even be why they had chosen to come, despite the fact their heiress hadn't died at Aina's hands. She had only lost her body. But the truth was still the fact that the spirituals' religion was almost always neutral in all matters, and the air wars was yet another exception. Due to all of this, the families most used to butting heads for supremacy over the human domain was the Morales and Seward families. If one surpassed the other obviously wouldn't be able to tolerate it. This was why the Seward family had pulled so many strings to place Mykarth in this position, and he had to represent them well. Mykarth had matured a great deal in the last over 20 years, and his control over his temper was more fit for a middle-aged man, although he did still look not much older than Lionel. So, he spoke with far more calm than what his heart was experiencing. NO-VE/L-B-1/N, your words are a bit inappropriate, Morales Patriarch. These are not offerings, they are not gifts either, they are payment in exchange for the lives you've ripped from the human domain. Oh. Lionel's brows shot up. Indeed, I guess that is the case. I seem to remember that I gave quite a fair warning, though. And some people overestimated themselves and chose to ignore it. Lionel's smile was just the same, and everyone remembered exactly what he was talking about, and yet, as though to drive home the point, he waved a hand. The words he had spoken that day rung again. As many as he saw was as many as he would kill. As I see it, Lionel continued, it's an act of kindness on my part to provide this opportunity. So, before I take it away, I would advise that you curb the edge in your tone. I use the word offerings because that is exactly what they are. The lives of your lost geniuses aren't worth even a single hair on my head, and yet they all entered with only two purposes. The first was to trample the dignity of the Morales by proving that the geniuses of your families were superior, and the second was to kill me. Lionel's smile was just the same, but his words were cutting. Inwardly, Mykarth was flustered. Lionel continued to be far more direct and scathing than he expected. He had come here with the thought that the sharpest words spoken would be under cloak and dagger, hidden in trap-laced sentences and paragraphs of subterfuge. But that wasn't what he received at all. Lionel was coming right at them, and his words and expression might be coated in a thin layer of politeness, but it was exactly that, thin. These offerings are to appease my anger, to allow your families and organizations a chance to raise your heads and attempt to compete with me again, as ill-fated as your geniuses will be if they should choose to do so. But don't misunderstand the situation. The power to return their lives to you lies in my hands and my hands alone. The choice to use said power lies in my hands and my hands alone. Do you understand? Lionel's emperor's charm was so imposing that Mykarth almost cracked, involuntarily mouthing the word yes. But luckily, in the last moment, he managed to stifle his throat, choking down the sounds of the coming word and instead entering a fit of coughing as though food had gone down the wrong pipe. Now, I'll repeat myself for the only time today, Lionel's smile beamed. Dear guests, I assume you've come with the offerings? A silence fell. The elders of the Morales had mixed reactions, though they were sharp enough not to show it on their faces. Many felt a bone-deep satisfaction, many more felt that the end of the world was coming, and even those that did feel satisfied began to tremble inwardly afterward, experiencing what one might after an extremely greasy meal. It was delicious, but at what cost? Chapter 2271. Published at 26th of October 2023 11:27 and 23 seconds AM. Chapter 2271. A proud Seward. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2271. A proud Seward. Mykarth no longer knew what to say. All of this preparation flew out the window and his experience, or lack thereof, was showing plainly. To make matters worse, his cough still hadn't disappeared, and the more he tried to stop it, the worse it became. Every time he held the cough back, there would be a slight few seconds of silence before the fit began again. He was making his own situation worse and worse by not allowing it to see itself through to the end. It was when the situation seemed unsalvageable and his face was as ripe as a tomato that a young man stepped forward. This young man was handsome, almost too handsome. It reminded Lionel a lot of Wise Star Order in that regard. His hair was a flickering bluish-gray that shone more like light than filaments of hair, and his eyes were a dreamy sort of violet, not pale like Lionel's, but rather cool in hue and deep in resonance. It was easy to get lost in them, and it was only made more potent by the fact this violet faded to sky blue near the edges of his irises. It was clear with a single look that this man was a spiritual, or at least half of one. He was the representation of the spiritual's religion, Ivan, a powerful junior ancestor himself and the backup plan in case Mykarth fell flat on his face. However, before Ivan could even speak, Lionel held up a hand. A law of sorts seemed to bind Ivan's mouth. He could still move freely, but even when he moved to clear his throat no sounds came out. It was as though he had been made a functional mute. "Forgive me, but I'm still in the middle of grieving. If a spiritual speaks in my presence right now, I can't promise I won't kill them," Lionel said lightly. His tone was far more somber and light than it had been previously. The edge of cheeriness and carefreeness had vanished, and even without saying it in so many words, the position of the spiritual's religion became precarious. They were supposedly the neutral party, but the race they worshipped had acted against the human domain. This was an undeniable fact. Velasco was clearly a man that could hold up the skies, and yet the spiritual emperor had come to attack maybe their greatest hope, at least that was how the smaller families saw it. The situation was going from bad to worse, and even the Morales elders were beginning to fidget in their seats. The only ones who seemed emboldened and prideful were the two youths to Lionel's back. They were beaming, feeling intoxicated by the prowess of their patriarch. And that was exactly why they were here. All of these messengers were so focused on Lionel and the two youths that had humiliated them that they couldn't catch on the micro-slips in the expressions of the Morales elders. However, the situation was only becoming more and more tense. Lionel didn't seem like he had a plan. It looked as though he was just venting his frustration. But even if it made him feel good for now, what would they do afterward? A man cleared his throat. This was of the Suyard family, dressed in silver robes that radiated a sword light when reflecting the sun in just the right way. "Excuse me, Morales Patriarch, but I believe that the spirituals race is the only one that didn't take advantage of our situation to attack. It's a bit inappropriate to treat them like this, no? Also, the spiritual religion is quite misunderstood. They do not worship spirituals, but rather their way of life, their oneness with nature, their balance with the elements. It is not the same as worshipping the race. And even if they did worship the race, I do not believe it is as big of an issue as the patriarch makes it out to be. There are many half-spirituals in our lands, but have you ever seen any half-nomads? Or half-dwarves? Or half-rapaks? The spirituals are the one race that do not treat us as lessers, but rather as equals enough to be life partners and mates. I cannot speak to why that spiritual chose to attack Hero Velasco. I do not wield that kind of power, nor do I claim to understand the thoughts of ancestors. What I can say is that during the day of that battle, it wasn't any one person that killed Hero Velasco, but rather the workings of the heaven themselves. Hero Velasco was a loner, a man who completed a great deal of experiments that he never shared with anyone, maybe other than you, his son. It is impossible to tell how he might have enraged the heavens, but I hope that you can put your personal biases to think about why else a noble spiritual might have chosen to attack your father. That was it. Those words were finally spoken and everything would be over. The elders of the Morales were quite sharp people. They could see the willingness to die in the man's eyes. He was old and wrinkled, even more so than the Overlord had been when he first appeared before Lionel. He might not live for more than a few more months or a couple of years even if he was able to walk out of here. But speaking these words alone was what he had needed to do. Lionel would lose his temper, maybe even kill all those here using the power of the Morales. Once he had spoken out this sentiment, it would boil and fester, and soon the title of Hero Velasco he had used to soften Lionel's position so that the latter would allow him to finish would become nothing more than a joke. Wuxia could already sense it, the shifting tide, the skepticism of the smaller families he had brought with him, and even the faint anger radiating from the elders of the Morales. His mission was complete and he could finally close his eyes, a proud Suyard. N-0ve1bn that he did. He closed his eyes and waited for Lionel's strike, a smile of pride on his face no weaker than that of the children to Lionel's back. He was a Suyard of the sword. He would die with his back straight, a smile on his face, and a hand on his sword. His hand slowly reached up, gently descending toward the hilt he had known all his life. Chapter 2272. Published at 26th of October 2023 11:27 and 21 seconds AM. Chapter 2272. No? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2272. No? Locke's hand missed, swinging at the air. He was inwardly stunned, so much so that he opened his eyes. His sword had always been there, it was the one thing that never failed him, and even with access to all the spatial treasures he could ever hope to use in a single lifetime, he still chose to hang it by his waist. He was so used to this sword that he could find it blindfolded in the depths of a black hole if he had to, so how could he have? The sword wasn't there. Locke's eyes snapped open and he looked at his waist. It was all gone, his trusted sword wasn't there. The blade of that sword had changed over the years, but the hilt was always the exact same. He asked every swordsmith he had ever worked with to transfer it over. It was the blade hilt his father had passed down to him, and a blade hilt his grandfather had passed on to his father before him. This was tradition of most of the Suyard. They didn't believe in keeping the same blade all your life. That wasn't being a swordsman, that was being stupid. No one could deny the strength of a weapon and how much it aided your combat prowess. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that this sword hilt was as important as his entire lineage to him. The only reason why he had even brought it when he expected to die was 1, because it gave him courage, and 2, because he believed that the protective measures Mykarth had with him would allow him to bring the sword out. But now, Locke looked up to find that the sword was in Lionel's hands, being lightly swung with a grace he didn't think should have been possible for a spear master, and that Lionel was. There was no denying that his spearmanship had surpassed even more of the elder generation, but the sword didn't look out of place in his hands at all. I've always found swords to be interesting. If it wasn't for the fact the weapon of a man I killed when the metamorphosis first descended upon Earth was a spear, I might have actually picked up a sword first. Though. Lionel swung the sword again. Maybe not, I was also quite a prudent and calculated fighter back then. I would have probably concluded that a layman like myself would do better with a longer stick. Better chance of not dying, and all. Lionel looked up with a smile. The sword rang and the echo of sword force manifested with almost too much ease. It was sharp and powerful, though silvery white unlike his spear force and his bow force. However, it was 7th dimensional. That's the kind of person I am, Lionel continued. I like to be prudent, cautious, I like to calculate out every step, and while that wasn't the case in the past, I no longer hesitate to kill. I find that doing so is a waste of my effort, trying to figure out the worth of a life, who deserves to live, who deserves to die. It's all very tiresome. And not to be rude, but if I can't figure it out, all of you most certainly can't. Your plan is filled with far too many loopholes. Send the bushy-eyed youth forward first, let him stumble. Then, attempt a save with a person you were quite certain ID never let speak, before you follow through with your real plan. And it's even better for the Suyard, isn't it? After all, it would be your real representation and not this pseudo-representative doing the speaking, right? And then what? You would use the rage I showed as an excuse to attack. Maybe if try to rope me and my Morales family in with the demons like you did the Silver Empire and find an excuse for Shield Cross Stars and the Void Palace to act too, is that it? The silence was palpable, but Lionel didn't seem to need to bounce his ideas off of anyone. At the same time, you'd have something to tell the masses. Hero Velasco was just a joke of a man who experimented with what he shouldn't and brought down upon himself the ire of the gods. The spirituals and the other races weren't attacking the human domain at all, rather they were just doing their best to stop Velasco from bringing down the wrath of the gods upon you all, right? They weren't cowardly scum at all, in fact they were trying to save everyone. And the cherry on top was that maybe if Hero Velasco had shared his research, and spread the truth of how he had grown so powerful so quickly, and how his wife and son seemed to do the exact same, then none of this would have ever happened. Everyone could have resisted the gods together, and rather than striking down Hero Velasco, you could have worked together to fight against the oppression and lead the human domain to a brighter future. Lionel tapped the sword with his other hand, running his finger along its blade toward its hilt. With every inch that he passed, the blade crumbled. It looked as though it was being burned to ash, and yet there was no heat in the air at all. It was like Lionel had simply commanded it to crumble, and it heated. Locke's chest constricted as his treasured sword was suddenly left with nothing more than its hilt. Lionel spun it in his hands, letting it land on the tip of his finger as it continued to spin. Is that all about right? It's a pretty stupid scheme if you ask me. It lacks any sort of cleverness or flair. It relies entirely on the ignorance of the people to the truth of the situation, and even relies on your own ignorance as well, not that you care very much to correct whatever those misconceptions were. Lionel caught the hilt in the air and his smile vanished. He didn't do anything, but those messengers that were present suddenly wanted to fall to their knees and plead for mercy, the weight on their souls nearly crushing them. You've all miscalculated, though, unfortunately. You can all return. I think the purpose of this meeting is over. When you go back, tell your people that the Morales will be coming, to clear the name of both their hero, and the stain you tried to place upon us. Lionel crushed the hilt in his hands, letting it burn to ash. Lionel's smile returned as he looked toward Locke. He didn't speak, but a voice echoed in Locke's hands. Kill you? You value yourself too much. I would much rather kill whoever told you to speak those words. It would be much more interesting if you were alive to see your treasured sword family burned to the ground, no? N/O/V. Epsilon L B/-1/N. Chapter 2273. Published at 30th of October 2023 6:39 and 39 seconds AM. Chapter 2273. Much better if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The silence was palpable. No one knew what to say. How correct were Lionel's words? 100%. How much did saying it aloud change? Practically next to nothing. In fact, they could take their chances by using the fact that Lionel had exposed them as a method he was trying to use to absolve himself and his father of wrongdoing. But something about Lionel's smile made them feel uneasy, uncomfortable and shaken. And it only became worse when his smile vanished. Tommy suddenly stepped forward and his glare looked down on them all. Didn't you hear what Patriarch Morales said? Scram. His words, as though they carried mysterious powers of their own, blew the envoys out of the large double doors. They rolled along the ground, their clothing being wrinkled and dust kicking up in their wakes. Interesting enough, the smaller families were spared the same fate. However, they got the message well enough as they rushed out, not wanting to be implicated in the same way. Mike Arth's expression was black as a pot as he rose to his feet as quickly as he could while pretending not to be in a sorry state, but even this wouldn't last for very long as he looked up into the skies. Their ships. They were gone. He wanted to roar out and demand an explanation, but he noticed that no matter how he strained his voice, no sound seemed to come out at all. It was as though the laws of the world were restricting him, suffocating his voice and muting him for all to see. It was just them. The sixth-dimensional families still had their warships very much intact and they rushed away. Inwardly, they understood that this was Lionel giving them a chance to turn to his side, and they even had the offerings prepared for their youth, but now they didn't dare to complete the exchange. The implications were very much different now and soon they might be forced to pick a side, but they preferred to sit on the fence for as long as possible. As for the loss of their youths, the honest truth was that if it gave their families a chance to survive this coming storm, the cost of a single genius or even many was a worthy price for these small families to pay. That was the harsh reality. A single genius would have never changed their fates. Their best couldn't compare to the likes of Amory, or Simona, or Armand, or any number of the other members of the Cataclysm Zone. It wasn't worth it to risk the whole family for them. At least not without the consent of their own upper echelon. The seventh-dimensional families that had come to pressure Lionel grit their teeth. They had been robbed in broad daylight and they couldn't even voice their complaints. They tried to send messages to their families, but they realized that even this was blocked. It seemed that without Morales' territory, there would be absolutely nothing they could do. They could only go the long way, leaving by foot and through air under their own power. I think you should take a look at N-0 Velbin. The laughter and jeers of the Morales citizens echoed through the skies as they rushed away. Their faces burned and their anger was palpable, but they didn't dare to attack. Even if they had the balls to, they felt like an all-seeing eye was bearing down on them from above, observing each and every one of their actions. And even if it wasn't there, what chance did the small handful of them stand against so many Morales? The elders wouldn't even have to take action, they would be drowned by six-dimensional experts. This seemed like a great victory, but after the doors of the Morales palace closed, the elders seemed to boil over with all of the emotions that they had kept bottled up, the leader of which was Elder Arya. Lionel could already read her impression of him from a mile away, and right now she couldn't seem to control herself at all as she exploded. Patriarch. This was highly inappropriate. You've put the entire family on the brink of destruction. Tommy and Nora Morales, who had just been in exceptionally high spirits, looked around in confusion. Wasn't this a great thing? What was happening? Elder Arya realized that there were still third parties here and that she had exploded too soon. She made a move to dismiss the two children, but before she could, Lionel held up a hand. His smile had returned and she met her eyes. What would you suggest we do? Arya took a breath and regained her composure, her eyes becoming more piercing. They were just messengers. Since things have come this far, well, catch them, detain them, accuse them of disrespecting the Morales family name and jail them. Well, send a message to their families and organizations, demanding compensation. This compensation will be less than what you asked for their geniuses. When they come forward with this compensation, we will return both their messenger and their genius as a sign of goodwill. To the public we will appear both strong and magnanimous, while politically, we will sow more relationships than enemies. It will fix all of this. The elders fell into silence and Lionel even saw many of them visibly relax. This was an excellent plan, and a win in all directions. It was the kind of plan their patriarch should have been the one to come up with, but there was a reason they were a council. Their patriarchs were often young and needed guidance, their help would fix everything. Even Lionel's brows rose up, and in the end, he happily laughed and even clapped. That is very much not the response I expected, Lionel said cheerily. I thought that your solution would be to have me step down and give the excuse of grieving to deal with this situation, but I must admit that I was wrong. I apologize, Elder Arya. Elder Arya snorted. What a joke. Even if she wanted to do that, it would make the Morales look weak to have their patriarch step down due to the pressure of other families. She would never allow that. However, I still like my plan better. Chapter 2274. Published at 30th of October 2023 6:39 and 38 seconds AM. Chapter 2274. You don't believe me? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Elder Arya was stunned silent, and then her expression twisted. You dash. Lionel held up a hand. Do not misunderstand. I respect my elders and your experience. I am not casually dismissing your plans out of malice or anger, nor am I acting out of emotion. Though, even if I was, it really wouldn't make much of a difference, Lionel thought to himself with a smile. Whether he was being emotional or not, he didn't believe there were many, if any, who could outmaneuver him in this world. Victory would be certain one way or another, but since he had his wits about him, He might as well be calm and calculated, taking the best and most perfect course of action. Arya grit her teeth, but since Lionel had spoken so clearly, it was her duty to calm down and listen to him. She really wanted to hear what he could possibly say that was better than her plan. First, you all need to understand something. If we cannot get on the same page, we will never be in harmony, and if we lack harmony, you all will fight me every step of the way. You need to understand that these choices I'm making aren't only because they will benefit the Morales family the most, but also because there is no other choice. Lionel looked through them one by one. I know you heard my words, I know you feel that they are reasonable, and I know that in your thoughts, you believe that the only thing we can do against such allegations is to stall. But do you know what these families fear the most right now? Arya's jaw tightened. That's right. You're all very experienced. What they fear the most is us having time. They fear us unearthing the potential of our new lineage factor, of birthing more talents that have acclimated to it from birth, of me potentially sharing whatever illusory and mysterious plan my father has to help others improve greatly in a short period of time. This month or so they've given us since the death of my father wasn't out of courtesy, it was the time they needed to prepare, to line all their ducks in a row, to make sure that they were ready for war at any given time. Second Nova, Lionel suddenly called out. A subtle portal of spatial force opened up, and Oren appeared. He was slightly confused at first, but he quickly focused and bowed to the elders around. Lionel grinned. Your information networks are some of the best in the human domain, no? The best, Oren corrected out of habit. He hesitated afterward, but then he felt that being humble right now wouldn't suit him. If anything, it would just annoy him. He had his own pride as a Morales and a demon, for that matter. And what would you say the odds the seventh-dimensional families are preparing for war? Oren blinked in confusion. Well, 100%, but isn't that obvious considering the sudden invasion by the other domains? Of course there. Oren trailed off, and his heart jumped several beats. Having information was one thing. Interpreting it properly was a completely different matter. If information was enough to understand every and all things, then who would ever fail to answer a mathematics problem? Who would ever mistakenly answer a reading comprehension question? It was all too easy to get lost in the weeds of unimportant information. I think you should take a look at, and Oren, too, had made that mistake. He had gathered quite a bit of intel on the movements of the families and how much preparation they were doing for war, and to him, and the rest of the Morales for that matter, it was just a matter of simple logic. The human domain had just suffered a devastating attack. Why wouldn't the most powerful families be preparing? What he had neglected was the fact that this was also the perfect shroud, the perfect wool over their eyes, the perfect misdirection. Were these families really preparing for another invasion? How had the Morales prepared? They called all their citizens, huddling them up in their capital's solar system, and deployed sentries to scout and make sure that no one encroached on their territory. This was how you might best prepare for a coming invasion. But what had those families done? Nothing of the sort. They gathered resources, called back their warriors, tightened control over various human domain organizations, and then, they sent out envoys to pressure the Morales family? A family that would be one of their biggest allies during an invasion? When it was put like this, even a fool could see it. Oren almost felt like an idiot for not seeing it sooner. Looking at Lionel, he felt that he understood why he had lost so handily. Of course, he had never entered the air wars for victory. His only goal was to deal with Third Nova. But even so, something told him it wouldn't have mattered even if he had intentions for victory. Oren took a deep breath. They want to strike us a blow. Lionel smiled, and Arya and the other elders remained silent. They understood even without it being said in so many words. There was never room to compromise, and there was never room to stall. War was already on their front porch, and Lionel seemed to be the only one who had noticed. Then, Lionel suddenly spoke. The second thing you need to understand is that even if this wasn't the case, I would still attack. Why? Because we are in an undefeatable position. The elders frowned. No? You don't believe me? Lionel waved a hand, and countless runes appeared in the air. The elders suddenly felt light as air, as though they could run at double the speed. But then they suddenly felt as heavy as boulders, their arms and legs not moving like they wanted them to. And then their force surged, rushing through their nodal pathways like raging rivers, but then the reverse almost buried them into their seats and an instant later. Novel B, 1N, controlling their abilities to speak or not wasn't a parlor trick, Lionel beamed. It's an ability that requires fundamental control over this world's very laws. If they step within our borders, they die. This was already shocking enough, but this wasn't what Lionel was banking on at all because he felt they still didn't understand exactly what this meant. Instead, he had something they would understand with far greater clarity. Chapter 2275. Published at 30th of October 2023 6:39 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 2275. Undefeatable position. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel looked at them, and he could see that they didn't understand. Or, maybe they did, and they just didn't understand how far it could go. Sure, seventh-dimensional existences would be the backbone of any powerful army, but how many of them could Lionel use it on at once? And let's say that he could use it on an infinite number and practically cripple their battle strength. What good was it against ancestors? Even if the Morales wiped the floor with every seventh-dimensional expert the others could throw at them, when their ancestors were all defeated beneath the sheer numbers they would be forced to face, what good would it do? Once all the Morales ancestors were dead, the ancestors of the opposing families would just turn their attention toward them, and then what? They would all be massacred to the last man. No amount of advantages and help would close the gap between the seventh and eighth dimensions. Your worries aren't warranted. You know as well as anyone that the ancestors didn't want me to become patriarch, at least not so easily, and yet what happened? The elders froze. Indeed, Alvaro and Isa weren't happy at all, an overlord had even appeared. They had forgotten about this matter because they just chalked it up to the overlord taking favor upon Lionel, but was that really what happened? It doesn't really matter whether you believe me or not, though, at least not for now. Because you've understood the first point well enough. There is no taking a step back, there is only forward now, and we can only walk that path together. Lionel grinned. What I can help you with, though, is all that worry. He snapped his finger, and a soul appeared. It took shape and quickly formed a vibrant violet armor. It was a behemoth of a man, and they immediately recognized him as the genius of the Tor family, Armand. But now, Armand took a knee before Lionel, his gaze filled with subservience. Greetings, King. Tell me, Armand. What is the structure of the Tor family armies? Yes, King. The Tor family has a total of 200,000 Tier 9 God Path 7th dimensional experts. They're led by the General of Earth, the General of Love, the General of War, and the General of Strength, each one a junior ancestor with exceptional combat prowess. We have 6 ancestors. Ancestor Orion, Ancestor Pleiades. The greatest trump card of our Tor family, at least as far as I know, King, is the constellation formation, as it is for all constellation families. Gathering together all 6 ancestors, and the pride of our family, the constellation can enter a sort of berserk state that allows the ancestors to tap into greater power. This trump card can only be used while within our territory, but it is exceptionally powerful. The time of use should vary from family to family, but it lasts about 3 hours for us. Some other trump cards include the first ancestor's battle axe. It is a life-grade weapon and it has a life-steal ability. It is said that our first ancestor was a blood sovereign and had exceptional earth affinity. He was able to forge this weapon despite not being a crafter, and when used in the hands of an ancestor, their stamina is as unlimited as their number of kills. So long as the blade tastes blood, the ancestor will never falter. Another trump card. Armand continued to talk, holding nothing back and filling the hall with so much information that even the elders felt overwhelmed. Was there such a thing as too much information? How would they even take advantage of all of this? But seeing Lionel's laughter, and remembering what he had done during the air wars, they felt a unique weight being lifted up and off their shoulders. Lionel didn't even wait for Armand to finish. This was all a farce. He had already documented and stored all this information, both physically and in his mind. The plans he had for each and every family were on a completely different level, but what was more amusing than this was what he would do first. With a thought, Lionel brought out a powerful ore that exuded a great amount of pressure. It was an 8th-dimensional ore, one that had only been produced in Morales lands, and of course he had taken it without asking. But very soon, they would understand why. I think you should take a look at with a smile, he spoke. Breathe. Armand shuddered with excitement, and his soul was suddenly absorbed into the orb. This ore was known as Blood Diamond Oregon. It was one born in the depths of thick combat and blood, and it carried aspects of blood force and earth force, ironically an ore that was a perfect match for the first ancestor Tor's weapon. N-0 Velbin the ore boomed and expanded, and soon a fully armored, and more importantly, flesh-covered Armand appeared. This was the true use of breathe. With an adequate sacrifice, a soul he forced to arise would gain permanence beyond the 24-hour period. The more talented the soul, the more powerful it was, the higher the required sacrifice. This blood diamond ore was actually far more than what Armand needed, but Lionel could also use breathe as a proxy to strengthen his souls as well. When the process was complete, he could decide the new construction's level of autonomy. If he wanted its growth potential, he would have to give it more autonomy. If he wanted its immediate strength and complete loyalty far more, then he would restrict its autonomy. Though, he could change these matters later so long as he did it within a certain time frame. And of course, he had chosen to restrict Armand's autonomy. Lionel grinned. Return to your family. Yes, King. Armand rushed away without even glancing toward the Morales ancestors. Lionel beamed, raising up the silver tablet. I can resurrect people with this tablet and they'll be complete and whole. Or, I can resurrect people with a sacrifice and my strength, in which case they'll be completely under my control. I think you've all forgotten. I meant it when I said we are in an undefeatable position. No matter how many below ancestor level brothers and sisters die, so long as they are a Morales, I can bring them back. The Morales elders were beyond shaken for the final time that day. Chapter 2276. Published at 30th of October 2023 6:39 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 2276. Goal? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2276. Goal? There's no time to wait. The attacks will begin within the day. And by attacks, I mean our own. Lionel stood to his feet, the shock of the elders not moving him. But the others. Elder Arya tried to speak, but she was far more hesitant and unsure. Nora had never seen her mentor like this, and it made her respect for Lionel skyrocket. Her eyes sparkled as she looked toward Lionel's back, but her discipline was strong as her expression remained professional, imitating her mentor. I only retained Armand to show you all. Before I even came here, I had already sent the other geniuses back, and I also noted down all of the information that I needed to as well. I have a perfect battle plan in place for each and every 7th-dimensional family. We will attack in one sweep and I will lead every charge. You will. Lionel's figure flickered and clones of himself manifested one after another. However, these clones didn't seem normal. Instead, they were like a cross of soul constructs and something beyond. Were they crafts? How was that possible? Elder Arya's heart skipped a beat. As a crafter a step from the life grade herself, her experience was great and untold, but she felt wholly inferior just seeing this scene. She couldn't even begin to tell just how Lionel had done it, nothing she thought of made sense. And of course she couldn't. This craft was a combination of Little Tolly's help, his King's Might lineage factor, and his crafting expertise. It was impossible for a crafter alone to accomplish this, at least not at Lionel's current level. The first thing he did was intimately understand breathe. He couldn't do this without his enlightened self, but what also made it far easier was the help he received from his vital star force, raising it to a half-step from impetus state. Breathe was ultimately a bridge from inanimate to the animate, a connection that gave something dead life. The second thing he did was create the perfect ore for himself. Compared to the blood diamond ore, it was far more valuable, and it drained his wealth. This ore didn't have a name, so Lionel simply named it the King Oregon. It was the perfect representation of him, carrying every aspect of his affinities and skills. This obviously relied on little Tolly, but what relied on little Tolly far more was what happened next. Lionel had to place a small part of himself within every king ore, and then use breathe on himself. He wasn't quite sure how to succeed in this, and everything he tried only harmed himself to no benefit. But then little Tolly, as he always seemed to do these days, made it impossibly easy. Little Tolly simply latched onto each piece itself, carrying with it its connection to Lionel. Then, when Lionel used breathe, each clone gained a small bit of himself, and an aspect of Tolliver. Originally, he thought that this might harm the little one, so he did just one as a practice run, but to his shock, it was like nothing had happened at all. Before, there was a limit to how much he could split Tolliver, and he could only work on 1,000 or so crafts at the same time. But now, Tolliver had completely shed those limitations. Though Lionel hadn't tested it, it might as well have been infinite to him because it was over the capacity his own mind could even handle. As a result, forming one copy of himself to lead each army was impossibly easy. The Morales ancestors might have usually already complained. Lionel was the least experienced of them all, but now it seemed that he wanted to take control of everything. Were they going to trust a youth to decide the destiny of a family that had existed for thousands of years? But none of the elders remaining had the face to do such a thing. They remained silent and let the ancestors make the choice, their silence speaking for itself. It was then that a voice echoed. Littlest Nova will be the supreme commander of this war. Listen to his every order. The elders shuddered. They wouldn't normally recognize this voice, but they had learned who this man was just a day or so ago. The overlord of their family. Lionel had already walked out from the palace even as the voice sounded. It seemed that he had already expected as much, and nothing about this matter could surprise him. The elders rushed after him, the first to appear being Elder Chris. Please command me, Patriarch. She spoke in a low shout. Build me 12 armies. Each must have a size of 10 million. Seventh dimensional experts only. All 12 Lionels spoke in unison. Within each, there must be an organization of sets of 10, then 100, then 1,000. Do not organize beyond that. Elder Chris inwardly questioned this kind of order. If the organization stopped at 1,000 with an army of that size, it would be a mess. That would mean 10,000 independent minds trying to work on their own. There wouldn't be any forward momentum whatsoever. NOV-/EL//B and the other problem was that 10 million was too small a number for a war on this scale. The numbers should start at billions. What was a scale of millions going to do? There were billions of Morales who had awakened at least one lineage factor in the Nova generation alone, let alone the others. But her discipline caused her to not even attempt to question it. Split the Tier 9 7th dimensional experts evenly, and do not add any junior ancestors. You all will anchor the home base. You have exactly 6 hours to accomplish this, go. Elder Chris saluted and then vanished. Patriarch. What is our goal? Elder Arya tried to remain in line, but she wasn't raised in the military like Chris was, her discipline was nowhere near the same. The goal? Within a week, the Constellation Alliance will be brought to their knees. It seemed that he had taken the loss to heart, but not enough that it would affect his future advancement, and it filled the hearts of his father and the elders with pride. Marcelo Terrius stood before his son, a beaming smile on his face. It's good that you're all right, it's good. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, but he held back. Both he and his wife couldn't possibly be bundles of emotion. Even now, Teresa Terrius refused to let go of her son, holding on to her tightly. It had been hard for the two of them these last few days. They had understood the intentions of the elders, but they also wanted their son back. At the same time, they didn't want to treat a member of the cloud race as their own flesh and blood, as that would only hurt more. It could only be said that they had been greatly conflicted in recent days, and they couldn't be happier now. Nazag smiled. "There's no need to worry, Mom, Dad. I've learned from this, I'll only come back stronger. Leonel Morales released me this time, but next time, I'll make sure hell regret giving me this opportunity." Marcelo nodded firmly. He wanted to slap his son's shoulders, but his wife was in the way and he could only settle for a hearty laughter instead. "Nazag," Marcelo suddenly said, getting serious. "We'll be going to war soon. Although I don't want to put you in danger so soon after you've returned to us, there's no other choice. The Constellation families and much of the human domain have already decided to make a move on the Morales. We must be swift and surgical. You'll get your revenge very soon." Nazag nodded. "When will we move out?" Marcelo grinned with pride, seeing his son's eagerness. If Nazag had shown any hesitation, he would know that his previous bravado about learning from this loss had been nothing but a FAA sectionade. But now, he was certain his son had come back stronger. N/O/V/E/L-B/I/N. The war preparations are already finished, however the date of attack hasn't quite been settled yet. We need a sudden and swift attack, one that deals the Morales a devastating blow. Their momentum right now is far too fierce and we need to knock it down several levels before we take any further course of action. Families like the Morales and ours have extremely deep foundations. It's easy to deal a blow, but it's much harder to eliminate them from the roots. If we act, we need to do the latter. Understood, Father. I'll be ready. Good. Now go off, Elder Moody is waiting for you. I and your mother have our own part to play, and as do you. You are in the 7th dimension now, you have responsibilities. Boom. Marcelo never stopped speaking, but it might as well have been as though he had. The cacophony of sounds was so vicious and violent that all noise aside from it was washed away in a tsunami-like tide. The expression of the entire family changed and they rushed out onto their large balcony, looking up into the skies to find that it felt like it was falling. Chapter 2278. Published at 30th of October 2023, 6:39 and 33 seconds AM. Chapter 2278. My king, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2278. My king. Marcelo was shocked. This was the capital of the Terrius family, the core of the Constellation Alliance. How could there be an attack here without any further information? How could they not have been alerted? Any family worth their salt would have countless outposts stretching from the edge of their territory to the very core. Even if dozens failed, there would still be dozens more. It simply didn't make sense for anyone to get this far without their knowledge. Marcelo's expression changed again as he realized something else. The planet's protective formation, a formation that had stood for hundreds of years and was maintained with the full force of the family, had fallen already. The quaking of the planet was none other than a sign of its collapse, and at this moment, the noblest of the Terrius family were on the chopping block. A single string from a Tier 2 warship could destroy the entire planet. Even if the ancestors took action now, it would still be too late. Just how had this happened? The worst-case scenario that Marcelo was expecting didn't happen. In the skies, half a dozen starships surrounded the planet. They were far smaller than anything Marcelo had ever seen before, but the power of their lasers was so precise that they perfectly targeted the weaknesses of their formation. Each was about the quarter the size of a normal moon, and their swiftness was unlike anything he had ever seen before. They moved with such fluidity out of the way of the retaliation of the Terrius family and then flew to one another's sides, forming a large force arc between them that repelled another onslaught back toward the planet. And then they appeared. Armored like a rainbow, battalions and troops of all kinds of solid colors. Marcelo had never seen an army like this one. It was normal for an army to have a single banner they flew under, and a single uniform they all shared. But he had never seen an army that had so many different armors at once, at least not when attacking as one unit. It felt disjointed, unprofessional, even a bit childish. Until it suddenly wasn't. A troop of 1,000,000 wearing shimmering white gold armors flickered, and before Marcelo could even understand what was happening, the next volley of attacks to the army passed right through them as though they weren't there. In fact, the volley flew right through the starships to their back as well. It wasn't until there was suddenly a devastating boom on the ground that Marcelo realized what was happening. It was all an illusion. Maybe they had never been in the skies in the first place. No, maybe it was that they had been in the skies, but while they were all focused on what was happening above, the battle on the ground had already begun. The retaliation of the Daoist family was swift. As an overlord, her and her many companions across the human domain never cared to pay attention to other air wars, except for this one. They knew the face of this young man well, but never did she think she would come face to face with him so very soon. Soon, all of the former strength of the Daoist family will vanish. At that time, you'll have a choice to make. It's either you'll subordinate yourselves to those four powers, or to me. I can tell you that the smart choice is the latter one, but I have a feeling that you're all going to make a decision out of emotion. All I can say to that is that I don't give second chances. If you don't want to live, feel free to choose the wrong side. Adios. Lionel gave the overlord a mock salute and then vanished in a twinkling starlight. The instant he did, Nazag paled. He used me. His words were full of grief and indignation, his legs buckling beneath him and his wails echoing through the holy land of the Daoist family. No one knew what to say. Some of them had seen the light come from Nazag, but they found it difficult to blame him. It seemed they didn't know just how intentional it all was. But they were still children in the overlord's eyes, and what they would be swayed by wasn't what an overlord would be swayed by. Detain him, she said coldly. Her teeth clenched and her chest heaved. Without the world spirit, she was staring down more than just the mortality of the Daoist family. She was also forced to face her own mortality. Without the world spirit, she would live at most a few more months, and not much more than a year at the very most. All the while, her strength would decrease day by day. It could be said that the function of the world spirit, aside from keeping her and other overlords alive, was for the sake of maintaining a constant outpouring of strength. Without it, their power would decline too much with their old age. Overlord Daoist watched as Nazag was captured and chained, but her reaction didn't change much, other than the biting of her lip. She could sense that Lionel's army was retreating after dealing them a devastating blow, and she felt her rage rising up to her. They had lost their world spirit. They had lost several ancestors. Their future seemed to remain intact, but what good were they without a strong backbone to begin with? The worst part was that she didn't know whether this was all that was happening either. It made sense for Lionel to attack them first. After all, he had a decided advantage against them. She hadn't thought that even her own arrows would be useless against him. And yet here they were. Overlord Daoist took out an item that looked like a talisman and then burned it with an odd white flame. However, her expression twisted when she realized immediately, even before it completely dissipated, that her message hadn't gone through. Lionel was already using their world spirit to interfere with the normal function of their world. She ground her teeth so loudly that the echoes resonated through the Holy Land. Chapter 2280. Published at 30th of October 2023 1:13 and 16 seconds p.m. Chapter 2280. Couldn't believe if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 2280. Couldn't believe Overlord Daoist took a breath and calmed herself. She refused to allow herself to remain flustered over a child. After a moment, she summoned the remaining 2 ancestors of the Daoist family and the remaining 2 from their subordinate families. The fact that the Daoist family still had an overlord remaining was actually a secret from their subordinates, but now wasn't the time to still retain a trump card. The appearance of Overlord Terius immediately settled the growing fissures between the Terius families and their branch families. However, it also made them realize just how bad the situation was if the death of 5 ancestors wasn't enough. Once they appeared, Overlord Terius began to speak immediately, taking control of the situation. My ability to communicate with the other families has been closed off, and I assume that their ability to contact us has been likewise cut off. I also cannot leave for fear that another attack might be launched, and the Alliance needs a stabilizing force right now. I will lay out the situation as plainly as possible. We have lost our world spirit. Nazag was used as a gateway to enter our holy land and locate it, while some method unknown to me was used to capture it. It's safe to say that within a certain range, the Morales family has the ability to steal any and all world spirits. I did not even have the chance to resist, let alone speak of resisting. With the current situation, our constellation will gradually weaken until our connection with it is lost entirely. Our lineage factor will follow it in weakening. As that happens, the hold that the Morales have on our territory will strengthen until this region is no different from any one of their other territories. Within a few years, this location will become an 8th-dimensional world as well, but this boon will have nothing to do with us as we will be beneath the thumb of the Morales. As things stand, there are only 2 options before us. The first is to kneel to the Morales. The second is to kneel to the Suyard family and the spirituals' religion. A family without a world spirit has no right to raise their heads high, and I only have a limited time left to effect change and help position us well for the future. When Overlord Terius finished speaking, there was nothing but somberness and frailty in the air. The 4 ancestors seemed to sink into their positions, realizing that they were almost helpless to do anything. Novi/LB, in. This very same conversation occurred all around the human domain. These families found themselves stretched thin, their world spirits snatched. Some were in an even worse position than others, not having even a single overlord to rely on and their speaking power being even weaker as a result. The Cancer family, the Ram family, the Virgo family, the Pisk family, the Cornus family. Of these, only the Ram family surprisingly had an overlord, a secret they had tightly held to themselves all the while, but in the end, it did them little better than the chance to jockey for position in the future. Some families were in more complicated straits, though, finding themselves torn in 2 directions for more than just benefits, but rather emotion as well. One of which being the Quarius family. Vega Quarius sat in her family's hall, her mind quite blank. Unlike the other families, there was no traitor among the Quarius, but that had only made their fate all the more devastating. Lionel's armies didn't pull back, instead they were led by the true Lionel. He bulldozed through their ranks with sheer force, and a great number of starships descended onto their planet. Lionel hadn't given the week-long timeline for most families. The families like the Terius had fallen in just a few hours. In fact, 10 of the 12 constellation families had fallen within a few hours, without even the chance to retaliate. The Gemini, the Leo, the Libra, the Taur, the Cornus, the Cancer, the Ram, the Virgo, and the Pisk families had all fallen. Ironically, it was due to her connection with First Nova that Vega's family had ended up among the worst. Well, relatively speaking. Many more of their 7th-dimensional experts had died, but their ancestors were intact. Of course, that was relative as well. Their ancestors were all bedridden, each one so heavily injured that this meeting could only be led by Vega's great-grandmother, and the only overlord of the Quarius family. The Quarius, the Gemini, the Libra, the Taur, the Terius, and the Ram families, the 6 that all had overlords among their ranks. In these past few weeks, Vega had gotten into a habit of blankly staring out into space. After Velasco had died, she had been called back to her family. Truthfully, she hadn't thought much of it. Lionel's mother had spoken out to help her and Adaworth's relationship, but now that Velasco was dead, her words held much less weight. She had had no choice but to return, not wanting to put undue pressure on the Morales. In fact, she had even returned in secret. What she hadn't expected was that when she returned home, she would hear of a war plan. She immediately tried to escape, but that had ended in her imprisonment, and imprisonment she had only been released from today so that her great-grandmother could interrogate her about her involvement and learn of whether she had been aware of this plan or not. She had been spared since she truly had no idea, but her fate in the family was precarious, not that it mattered much since the family's fate as a whole also seemed to be. Bang! Overlord Quarius' wrinkled palm slammed into the throne beneath her, nearly shattering it completely. The Quarius family will not stand for this. Chapter 2284. Published at 1st of November 2023 1:18 and 51 seconds p.m. Chapter 2284. Lionel Morales. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2284. Lionel Morales. Lionel looked toward the pious ancestor indifferently, but they were just as confused as everyone else was. His gaze changed focus and he looked down toward the holy land of the pious family, but he knew that it was a waste of his time. If they left so abruptly, so much so that even he couldn't quite figure out immediately how they had, then there was no doubt in his mind that there was nothing of use left. They wouldn't be that foolish. He didn't feel any sort of satisfaction. He would have felt much better if that old man had just died, but next time they met he would know to watch his mouth. Not that it would matter much, next time they met, he'd have the man's head on a pike. Just because he had controlled his rage, didn't mean that it wasn't still there. That man's words were clearly meant to taunt, and taunting an enraged Lionel was the last thing a person should do. As for who that old man was, it was impossible to tell with the information he had. Even his talks about the Godland family stabbing him in the back was nothing more than posturing. He had no idea what the Godland family was or what their plans were. He was only just well aware that they were far more powerful than they let on. He was far too sharp to be fooled by their acting, or what they thought was acting. The youths they had sent to the air wars were far too arrogant to be from a six-dimensional family, and their lineage factor had far more potential than they were letting on. This and the fact that Simona had abandoned Aina and his brothers in their time of greatest need was enough for him to act against the pious family. He wouldn't blame her for her actions, at least not to the point of punishing her for them, but he also wouldn't continue to treat her like some great ally. Wasn't that a joke? What had the pious family done for him in the air wars? If a percentage were to be given, it wouldn't even be one. Lionel slowly walked from the palace, his squadron following him. Then, he raised his spear. The Morales army roared with victory and the pious constellation seemed to almost flicker entirely out of existence. It would take some time before all 12 territories were truly Morales. But every day that passed, every second even, and along with every new territory they conquered, the more furious that momentum became. Soon, the entirety would be their territory and no one in the human domain would be able to stop them. Bang! Matriarch Pius watched in silence as the old man kicked at a mountain furiously, causing it to crumble practically to ash. It was just a false mountain, one created by the hands of man, but it was just as large and sturdy as a real mountain. It was just unfortunate that it had caused the ambience of this peaceful garden to crumble.